Chapter 2373. Although it seems strange that the overlords of the Overlords Alliance had made such a huge improvement in just over 3,000 years, it couldn't be any more normal. After all, none of the overlords of the Overlords Alliance were ordinary powerhouses. Each of them was the embodiment of some kind of tribulation, and these tribulations were the direct cause of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. In this way, their existence was naturally closely linked to the great tribulation of heaven and earth. In this way, they naturally received the blessing of the great tribulation of heaven and earth for hundreds of years. In the end, they continuously absorbed a large amount of nutrients from the great tribulation of heaven and earth, and their cultivation realm naturally kept improving. Obtaining such an obvious improvement in over 3,000 years was actually considered slow. In contrast, the many chaotic creatures in the Chaotic Alliance were also closely linked to the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. In the past 3,000 years, they had also absorbed endless nutrients from the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth, and their cultivation realm had also improved beyond imagination. The strongest among them, the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance, was already a false saint. It was precisely because the leaders of the two alliances were already at the false sage level that the two alliances were able to survive under the suppression of the Supreme Alliance that should have been destroyed. They did not collapse and perish under his methods. After all, although the heir of Duan was in despair and was many times stronger than ordinary false saints, he was also many times stronger than the strongest powerhouses of the Chaotic Alliance and the Overlords Alliance. However, that was only him. There was a shocking gap between the many cultivators under him and the other members of the two alliances, apart from the Alliance Masters. In the Supreme Alliance, apart from the era of Duan, the strongest powerhouse was only a false saint. Moreover, there were only a few of them. The remaining ones were only quasi-saints. In contrast, apart from the false saints in the Chaotic Alliance and the Overlords Alliance, most of the others were false saints. There were only a few quasi-saints. In this way, in terms of overall strength, the Chaotic Alliance and the Overlords Alliance had the upper hand. The reason why the Supreme Alliance still hadn't been destroyed was because the threat of the era of Duan was too great. He had become the backbone of the Supreme Alliance and supported it. This balanced situation between the three alliances had actually lasted for hundreds of years. Ever since the relationship between the two alliances had more or less stabilized until now. In order to guard against these two alliances, Duanshur controlled the Supreme Alliance and built countless fortresses at the borders of the two alliances with the help of the huge number of living beings that had survived. These fortresses were the terminals of the Paramount Alliance's power. They were the carriers that the Paramount Alliance used to deal with the other two alliances. All along, these fortresses had played a huge role in the fight against the two alliances, making it difficult for the Chaos Alliance and the Overlord Alliance to wreak havoc. Normally, it would not be easy for any alliance to destroy a fortress. This was because the power of the numerous fortresses were interconnected, and if one wanted to destroy one, it would definitely affect the countless other fortresses. In the end, due to the collusion of power, the attacking force would sink into the quagmire of war. However, what did Duanshur hear at that moment? Their fortress only lasted for 2 seconds under the attack of the Alliance of Chaos? Even the connection between the many fortresses didn't have time to react before the fortress and its guards were all turned into dust. How could Duanshur possibly accept something like this? With a thought, Duanshur's will rushed out of the palace and whizzed toward the land below. In the blink of an eye, it arrived in the southwest of the central mainland, where the fortress that had been razed to the ground was located. When his will arrived, he sensed an unimaginably terrifying power filling the land. This power contained an intense aura of primal chaos. It felt even more intense than the aura of primal chaos that he had sensed when he was at the border of the land. When his will arrived, he felt an unimaginable corrosion coming from the aura of primal chaos. It kept eroding his will, causing him unimaginable pain. What's going on? It's just the remnants of some primal chaos creatures. Could it really be able to activate the state of primal chaos? This thought flashed through Duan Shi's mind, and his expression became extremely ugly. During the process of his will being corroded, he felt excruciating pain. It was as if countless blunt knives were constantly cutting his body. Withstanding the intense pain, he looked over and saw a strange object floating in the void at the source of the aura of primal chaos. This strange object looked like a seal, a hammer, or a strange cauldron. It floated in the void and gave off an extremely strange feeling. The endless aura of primal chaos that could even corrode his will came from this strange object. Since you're here, don't leave. At this moment, a soft voice rang in his ears. Along with this sound, the strange and inexplicable thing trembled slightly, and then a chaotic brilliance flashed from it, turning into a light curtain, pressing down on him with overwhelming force. In the blink of an eye, the light curtain of primal chaos pressed down on his will, causing it to collapse with a loud crack. Then, Duan Shi's main body in the Supreme Palace clearly felt that the bit of will he sent out had been completely erased, leaving nothing behind. This is an artifact. At this moment, he had already made a judgment about that strange object. The feeling that the strange object emitted when it activated its power was the feeling of a powerful artifact activating its own power to attack the opponent. After understanding the nature of that object, he understood why the fortress that was targeting the alliance of primal chaos in the southwest had been wiped out so easily. The level of such an artifact had clearly exceeded his understanding. It could allow those false saints from the alliance of primal chaos to easily crush his will as a desperado. This was not something he could imagine at all, however. Although he could not imagine the level of that artifact, he still had to deal with it. At this moment, he forcefully suppressed the backlash brought about by his will being erased. With a slight thought, all kinds of indescribable waves began to spread out from the Supreme Palace. Through some extremely mysterious channel, they surged into the world below and poured into the almost endless fortresses. As these waves surged in, the endless fortresses erupted with powerful power. Waves of unimaginable power began to be released from the many fortresses. Through the communication channel between the fortresses, they continuously gathered in the southwest of the central continent. Finally, they gathered at the fortress that was closest to the erased fortress, causing the originally ordinary fortress to emit an extremely pure light. This light was so condensed and mysterious. After it appeared, it was like a sharp sword that tore apart the world, forcefully piercing through the surrounding chaotic aura that was getting denser and denser. Boom, 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 boom. Huge movements continuously came from the void around the fortress at this moment. Amidst this movement, the strange artifact floating above the southwest abyss also began to tremble. As it trembled, the entire savage land in the southwest seemed to be grabbed by an invisible giant hand and began to shake violently. On that strange artifact, figures kept appearing one after another. These figures were the many living beings in the alliance of primal chaos that had already reactivated their primal chaos imprints and turned into chaotic creatures again. At this moment, the number of these figures was the same as the number of chaotic creatures. Even the false saint, who was the alliance master, also appeared on this artifact. Below this magic treasure was an incomparably deep abyss. An abyss that led directly to the boundary between heaven and earth, and the state of chaos. Still want to stop us now? These words came from the many figures. As these words were spoken, the many figures finally fixed on an extremely strange figure. A powerful aura of a false saint was continuously released from its body. Obviously, this figure was the alliance master of the chaotic alliance, the false saint who supported the existence of the chaotic alliance. With these words, this strange artifact flashed slightly and disappeared from its original position. When it reappeared, it directly appeared at the place where all the power of the endless fortress was gathered and forcefully collided with the sword-like light released by the fortress. crack, an earth-shattering thunderclap suddenly rang out from the point of contact between the two. The light seemed to be invisible, but in fact, at this moment, the moment it came into contact with the artifact, it displayed an extremely strong physical effect. In the collision, countless cracks appeared on the light. It looked as if something incomparably sturdy had been smashed into pieces. With this earth-shattering thunderclap, the entire world shook. No matter where they were, whether they were far or close to this place, whether they were in direct contact with this place or not, they could all feel the unimaginable tremors erupting from their bodies at the same time. Those who were slightly weaker in controlling their bodies couldn't even stabilize their bodies and could only sway from the tremors. Faced with such a situation, Duan Shi's expression changed drastically. Is the final battle about to break out? Such a thought flashed through his mind. Before he could finish this thought, the light that had countless cracks was replenished out of thin air. The countless cracks were completely healed in the blink of an eye, as if there had never been any cracks before. In contrast, the strange artifact seemed to have suffered an extremely huge impact at this moment. Its aura that could break through and destroy everything was completely severed, causing it to be directly fixed in the void. The endless chaotic aura that it emitted was continuously stripped and shattered under the impact. So what if you have the blessing of the world? The figure that appeared on the artifact shouted at this moment. With this shout, the artifact began to tremble violently. As it trembled, the murderous aura that was formed from the great calamity of the world that permeated the entire world began to surge wildly. Endless power continued to gather at the artifact. Through the transformation of the artifact, it continuously transformed into another form, causing the artifact to slowly expand. The chaotic aura that was constantly being stripped also stabilized and maintained a complete state. It surrounded the artifact and continued to attack the light that erupted from the fortress, trying to break through it. The reason why it chose this fortress and this light was very simple. It was because this light had already sealed everything. As long as the artifact wanted to leave the wilderness in the southwest, it would definitely be attacked by this light and shackled by the fortress. Only by completely breaking the light and destroying the fortress could the artifact charge out of the wilderness in the southwest and enter a wider world to carry out the destruction that the great calamity of the world required. At this moment, in another direction, a roar erupted from the alliance of overlords. Following the roar, incomparably intense murderous aura began to gather at the alliance of overlords. The alliance of overlords was located in the northeast of the central mainland, which happened to be directly opposite the alliance of chaotic forces. At this moment, such a change occurred in the alliance of overlords, and it instantly formed another core where the murderous aura gathered in this world. This core was directly opposite the core of the murderous aura in the southwest where the artifact was located. A stable structure was vaguely formed between them, stirring up all the murderous aura in this world and mobilizing all the power of the great calamity of the world. They've also made a move. It seems like my feeling was right. The great calamity of the world has already lost its patience. At this moment, in a certain spacetime within the artifact, the false sage of the alliance of chaotic forces looked up at the empty sky, and this thought flashed through his mind. He was not the only one in this strange spacetime. All the members of the alliance of chaotic forces were here. All the other living beings gathered their power on him and poured it into the main body of the artifact. Through this infusion, they mobilized the power of the artifact and formed an impact on the world. Chapter 2374. If it had been up to the leader of the Chaotic Alliance, he would have waited for a few thousand years until the artifact that they had refined with the power of the entire alliance was perfected before taking action. Unlike now, when this magic treasure had only just taken form and was still a long way from perfection, he had to make his move. However, the reason why the Chaotic Alliance was able to take shape, the living beings within it were able to improve so much, and the artifact could be refined in such a short period of time was all because of the power of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, even if the living beings had complete intelligence, they would not be able to go against the will of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. The difference between a perfected artifact and an incomplete artifact was the existence of a flaw. It was precisely because this magic treasure had yet to be perfected that when this magic treasure was activated, the silhouettes of many controllers had to appear above the magic treasure. It was so that people could even see the process of changing between the strong and the weak during this kind of control. If the artifact was truly perfected, not only would there be no such phenomenon when it exerted its power, but its power would also be more complete and untraceable. Such a difference was naturally nothing to ordinary cultivators. Even if it was displayed before them, they would not be able to grasp this weakness. However, to the truly powerhouses, the appearance of such a flaw was akin to presenting their weakness to the other party. If the other party's reaction was fast enough, and their control over strength and power was strong enough, they could even directly send all kinds of attacks into the magical treasure through these traces, into the space where the members of the Alliance of Chaos were staying, and directly attack the bodies of these creatures. Even though the power of the attack would be greatly weakened and wouldn't be able to deal any fatal damage to these creatures, it was still a weakness that a normal cultivator should avoid at all costs. However, under the will of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, no matter what the living beings of the Chaotic Alliance thought, they could only obey it. Compared to the incarnations of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, which had been completely assimilated by the great tribulation of heaven and earth, their intelligence was suppressed to the point where it was almost non-existent. On the other hand, the intelligence of the living beings of the Chaotic Alliance was almost completely unaffected by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. They still maintained complete thinking abilities. Therefore, although he saw that his treasure had gained the upper hand and seemed to be pressuring the Supreme Alliance to the point that they were running for their lives, the Alliance Master had an ominous feeling in his heart. After all, he believed that the great tribulation of heaven and earth would know what he could see. How could he not know that the effect of activating this magic treasure would be 1,000 times better after a few thousand years? Since that was the case, didn't that mean that the tribulation of the heavens and earth had fallen into a disadvantageous position on a certain level? It was precisely because of this disadvantage that the great calamity of the world was forced to lose its patience, and it had no choice but to force them to take action at an imperfect moment. Although he had such a thought in his heart, he obviously couldn't say it out loud at this moment. He didn't even dare to show too much of a change in his expression. After all, this matter was too demoralizing. If other living beings found out about this, they might not have the heart to activate this magic treasure, causing the flaws that already existed to become even greater and causing them to die even faster. The treasure faced off against the many overlords of the Alliance from the other side, forming the two cores of the baleful aura in the entire world. An indescribable resonance began to appear between the two, causing them to continuously communicate and switch. The world began to tremble continuously as they did so. The endless murderous aura in the entire world seemed to have been sublimated due to the appearance of these two cores, and the performance of all aspects suddenly increased by a level. This caused the normal world, which had originally been able to maintain a balance with the murderous aura, to be pushed back by the murderous aura. The many fortresses built by the Supreme Alliance also operated frantically during this process. Endless might, power, and mystical abilities were continuously activated from these fortresses, and they began to crazily attack the wave of attacks formed by the murderous aura. In the Supreme Palace in the depths of the void, Duan Shur had already fallen into a state of frustration. The two alliances had suddenly attacked at the same time and used methods that he had never imagined to crush the many fortresses protecting the world. This was so sudden that he couldn't take an effective response to mobilize the power of the world to dispel these attacks. After all, although he was a despairing being, he wasn't omniscient, omnipotent, or omnipotent. How could he know how to deal with such a sudden attack without studying it clearly? It could be said that the preparations of the Supreme Alliance were extremely perfect for the many fortresses to be able to hold on and not collapse right away. The various powers, and mystical abilities that the fortresses had prepared were rather effective. The powers, and mystical abilities released by the fortresses were constantly being consumed, and the light of each fortress seemed to be constantly weakening. In the areas guarded by the fortresses, more and more places were being eroded by the murderous aura. In the end, their appearances changed, and they began to attack the various things that were still supporting the world. The situation of the entire world seemed to be heading towards collapse and extinction. An indescribable feeling of despair emerged in the hearts of many living beings. It was a kind of despair that couldn't see a way out. This kind of despair was the favorite of the murderous aura. When this kind of despair was produced, countless murderous auras would naturally invade the hearts of the living beings through this despair. They would constantly assimilate these living beings, causing them to become part of the power of the world's calamity and begin to join the tide of attacks on the world. This change suddenly sped up the collapse of the world by several times. In a trance, most of the entire world had already fallen into darkness. Only the fortresses and a small area around them were able to maintain the complete light, ensuring that the living beings inside and outside the fortresses were still the same. This situation was also constantly collapsing. Under the suppression of the endless murderous aura, even the remaining light was constantly shrinking. The power of the many fortresses also began to decline. In the end, the entire defense system that they had formed seemed increasingly powerless in the face of the murderous aura. Looks like this timing isn't too bad. In the strange artifact, the Alliance Master of the Primal Chaos Alliance heaved a sigh of relief. The situation before him had almost formed a snowball effect. The defeat of the world seemed to have fallen into an irreversible situation, causing his original worries to gradually fade. At this moment, the entire world suddenly began to tremble strangely. These tremors were so strange that they were incompatible with the tremors produced by the complete system formed by the murderous aura. However, they were equally obvious and extremely strange. Everyone that could sense the existence of these tremors could clearly distinguish this tremor from other tremors. Along with these tremors, strands of strange light erupted from the depths of the countless areas that had been completely eroded by the murderous aura. Although these rays of light were extremely weak, they possessed an unbelievable degree of flexibility. They easily split apart the darkness and revealed themselves to the outside. It was as if a candle had been lit in the darkness. Although the candlelight was small, it symbolized hope in the boundless darkness. At this moment, an inexplicable hope was ignited in the hearts of countless living beings that had been eroded by the murderous aura. They gradually began to resist the erosion of the murderous aura. Although this resistance wasn't strong, it didn't have the effect of completely removing the influence of the murderous aura. However, this resistance alone was enough to stop the living beings affected by the murderous aura from continuing their previous actions. This caused the murderous aura that permeated the entire world to lose its power to replenish itself. In the end, this caused the advantage of the murderous aura to gradually disappear in the resistance against the power of the world itself, causing the overall situation to gradually become balanced. What is this? In the strange artifact, the Alliance Master of the Primal Chaos Alliance revealed a look of disbelief in his eyes. In his eyes, all the changes in the entire world were reflected clearly. The candlelight that had suddenly appeared was naturally seen by him. However, because he saw this clearly, he couldn't believe what he was seeing, its master. At this moment, in the Supreme Alliance, Duan Shi was overjoyed. He felt an indescribable joy surging from the bottom of his heart. It could be said that Duan Shi had obtained Luo Fan's inheritance, so he was extremely familiar with Luo Fan's power and methods. At this moment, he could tell at a glance that the endless candlelight that had appeared in the entire world had the aura of his master. In other words, the appearance of the candlelight was obviously his master's method. At this moment, all the grudges he had against Luo Fan for not taking action vanished completely. What replaced it was an indescribable sense of admiration and shame. He admired the fact that Luo Fan had made all the preparations that would be effective at this moment many years ago. He was ashamed that he didn't believe in his master and thought that his master wasn't willing to take action. In an instant, it was as if he had grabbed onto a life-saving giant hand in the midst of endless despair. His initial feelings of despair turned into endless hope. His mind, which had become chaotic due to despair, also became lively again. As his mind became lively again, many things that he had previously ignored were imprinted in his eyes again. So this is the weakness. I didn't expect that I would turn a blind eye to this and force my master to take action. I'm really unfilial. Duan Shi suddenly had a look of realization and regret on his face. His eyes were directly locked on the strange magic treasure in the southwest direction. It was the figure of the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance that was constantly changing. Obviously, he had already noticed the weakness of this magic treasure. At this moment, the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance, who should have reacted fiercely, didn't react at all. He just floated in the air blankly and continued to control the magic treasure according to the previous steps, letting the magic treasure guide the endless murderous aura to attack the light pillar in front of him. The reason for this was that his mind was in a mess. He had already fallen into an unimaginable shock. Isn't he a natural enemy? Why would he help this world? If that's the case, what am I? Am I just a whetstone for him to train this world? All kinds of chaotic thoughts continuously surged out from the depths of his heart. In the end, they scattered all his thoughts and broke through his rationality, causing his reaction to the outside world to become extremely slow. Obviously, as an existence that was favored by his natural enemy, when he saw the many candles that appeared everywhere in this world, he could clearly feel the aura of his natural enemy. In other words, this was the method of his natural enemy. And the method of his natural enemy was actually helping this world at this moment. This obviously made him feel betrayed, or rather, abandoned. I've finally caught you. Just as he was thinking about this, an incomparably loud voice suddenly sounded in the space inside the magic treasure. Following this voice, the space inside the magic treasure began to tremble violently. The rules and principles, time, space, energy, and matter were all shaken at this moment. The entire space seemed to have turned into a fallen leaf that had fallen into a violent ocean. It seemed like it could capsize and be destroyed at any time. This change abruptly brought the creature back to his senses from the chaotic thoughts. At the same time, the other members of the Alliance of Chaos, who had originally put all their strength on him, also came back to their senses. What's going on? Has the magic treasure been broken? Angry shouts rang out from everywhere, reverberating in this entire space. The leader of the Alliance of Chaos instantly grasped the situation, and his expression changed drastically. Because at this moment, he noticed to his shock that the illusory figure that appeared on the magic treasure had been completely fixed in place, and the illusory connection between the illusory figure and the numerous living beings in this spacetime had been materialized by some sort of strange power. Moreover, the illusory connection between the illusory figure and the various living beings in this spacetime had been madly strengthened, and in the end, it formed a passageway that connected this spacetime to the outside world. This obviously only represented one fact, and that was, the weakness of this magic treasure that was not perfect had already been discovered by the opponent, and it was being exploited to the extreme. Chapter 2375. Under the impact of the boundless power, the invisible passageway kept trembling and collapsing. However, at the same time, it immediately reformed after collapsing, still maintaining the connection between the inside and the outside, allowing endless power from the outside to continuously enter this spacetime and shake this spacetime continuously. It could be said that the previous actions of this treasure had merely changed the original invisible passageway from a fixed state to a dynamic state. Although this is an extremely wonderful treasure, how can it compare to the heavens and the earth? At this moment, the voice of the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance spoke again. Upon hearing this, the Alliance Master's expression changed drastically. He finally lost all hope and let out a long sigh. As expected, a flaw is a flaw. In the end, it can't be covered up. At this moment, a very ordinary figure with 3 eyes and 4 elbows appeared in the sky of this space-time. Although this figure was only of an ordinary size, it had an unimaginable presence. As soon as he appeared, all the living beings in this space-time instantly focused their attention on him. It was as if there was an endless magnetic force on his body that was attracting all gazes. The moment they saw this figure, the expressions of many living beings changed drastically. This was because they were extremely familiar with this figure. It was their greatest enemy, the Alliance Master of the Supreme Alliance, Duan Shi. The 3 alliances had been enemies for thousands of years and were already extremely familiar with each other. Naturally, they knew what the Alliance Masters of each alliance looked like and what abilities they had. "It's actually you," the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance sighed. As this sigh was heard, many of the living beings in the surroundings, who originally had fearful looks in their eyes, seemed to be swept by a cool breeze. All of them recovered from their agitation and fear, and their expressions became calm again. "However, your biggest mistake was appearing here personally." The Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance instantly let out an angry roar. As this roar was heard, the entire space-time suddenly exploded, and endless terrifying power was released from the explosion. In the blink of an eye, it reversed and headed straight for Duan Shi, who was in the sky at this moment. At a glance, it seemed as if the endless fragments had turned into endless waves that were rapidly rushing towards Duan Shi. At that moment, Duan Shi felt like he had suddenly turned into an ordinary mortal, falling into the depths of a boundless ocean. The originally incomparably valiant power and the incomparably outstanding cultivation realm were all completely suppressed at this moment. He felt as if there were endless shackles binding him. He could only watch helplessly as the boundless power crushed him. However, Duan Shi wasn't too bothered by the changes. A faint smile appeared on his face. As he laughed, the entire space-time suddenly froze. The terrifying power that was enough to destroy the heavens and the earth, the boundless power, all stopped in midair in an instant, stopping just a few feet away from Duan Ji. It was as if an invisible hand had pressed the switch of time. "Since I dared to appear here, how could I not be prepared? Although this magic treasure is quite good, it has such a huge weakness. How can you still control it as you please after I discovered it?" Duan Shi sighed. As he sighed, he took a light step forward. His figure was like an illusory image as he slowly walked out of the encirclement of the boundless power and power, slowly arriving in front of the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance. At this moment, although the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance was extremely terrified and tried his best to stop Duan Shi from approaching and attacking him. However, his body, his strength, his power, his senses, his will, everything about him couldn't move at all. Even the life imprint that was filled with boundless chaotic aura was like an ordinary life imprint at this moment. It didn't have the almost absolute power that it used to have. It could only lie in the depths of his body obediently, waiting for an unpredictable fate to befall it. In the end, you're still an ingrate. You clearly have spiritual intelligence, yet you're standing on the side of the calamity of the world. Duan Shi sighed when he saw the expression of the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance. Then, he raised his palm and pressed it down on the Alliance Master. Pft, 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 pft. Soft sounds could be heard from within the leader's body. Immediately after, the leader's body seemed to be completely formed from smoke. With a gentle breeze, he disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there in the first place. Although the formation of this magic treasure was mostly due to the power of the calamity of the world, as the carrier of the magic treasure, the Alliance Master of the Chaotic Alliance actually occupied a rather important position in this magic treasure. In other words, the death of the Alliance Master at this moment had a huge impact on this magic treasure. At this moment, the entire magic treasure kept shaking and countless fine powder flew out from the inside of this strange magic treasure. It looked like countless powder was being shaken out continuously. Along with this change, the power of this magic treasure that was constantly attacking the invisible passage started to weaken, causing the invisible passage to become more stable at this moment. Duan Shi didn't stop at all, nor did he hesitate at all. He moved his body and appeared in front of the living beings. He also pressed his palm down on their heads, causing them to collapse in an instant and turn into endless powder that flew out. Along with this change, the degree of the magic treasure's shaking became even greater. The amount of dust that was shaken out of the magic treasure grew larger and larger. It felt like there was a cloud of smoke constantly leaking out of its body at this moment. Meanwhile, the power of the attacks on the invisible passageway continued to weaken. In the end, it could no longer shake the invisible passageway. It could only powerlessly crash into the passageway. It couldn't even shake or deform the passageway in the slightest. Faced with this change, Duan Shi let out a long sigh of relief. He thought to himself, "Fortunately, I borrowed teacher's power. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get rid of them so easily." That's right, he didn't rely on his own power or the power of the world when he easily froze this space-time and all the members of the Chaotic Alliance. Instead, he relied on the power of the countless candle-like lights that suddenly appeared everywhere. In other words, it was Luo Fan's power. The countless lights seemed to be randomly distributed without any pattern. However, only Duan Shi, who was extremely familiar with Luo Fan, knew that the distribution of these lights was extremely delicate and mysterious. Their existence itself formed an existence that was close to a formation, a divine ability, and a magic treasure. This kind of existence contained infinite power. Once it was activated, it could even allow Duan Shi, who was just a despairing person, to display strength that surpassed the level of a supreme emperor. Just now, he relied on the power granted by this kind of existence to easily suppress this space-time and all the members of the Chaotic Alliance before completely wiping them out. As Duan Shi let go of the suppression of this space-time, the space-time, along with the countless power and endless power that was produced when it turned into fragments, began to dissipate at this moment. Meanwhile, the magic treasure itself let out a rattling sound. Its originally strange appearance began to distort and change continuously. Seeing this, Duan Shi knew that he couldn't stay inside the magic treasure any longer. With a sway of his body, he left the inside of the destroyed space-time through the invisible passage and arrived in the outside world. At this moment, the strange magic treasure began to emit an indescribable light, as if countless terrifying bombs were detonating inside the magic treasure. Following that, a terrifying shockwave spread out from the magic treasure, turning the surrounding space-time, rules, laws, energy, matter, and everything else into powder. Even the main body of that magic treasure. The impact of the powder was extremely terrifying. If he ignored it, it might even cause half of the central mainland to collapse. The great calamity of heaven and earth had been trying for thousands of years to achieve this result. If things really developed to this point, Duan Shi's operation this time could be said to have failed completely. However, Duan Shi was obviously here now, so he naturally couldn't let this happen. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly. The power of the many arrangements that Luo Fan left behind swept out and instantly stopped the impact of the powder, causing the magic treasure that was collapsing in front of him to completely stop. The shock wave that was originally spreading out crazily turned into a strange physical form in an instant. "It's so heavy!" Duan Shi roared in his heart. Sweat kept pouring out of his body. However, it was extremely difficult for him to stop the magic treasure from collapsing. It was also extremely difficult. At the very least, at this moment, he felt like he was almost exhausted with this feeling. He naturally understood what he had to do. In that instant, he crazily detonated the strength he had obtained from Luo Fan's many arrangements. His perception seeped into the stagnant explosion in front of him, and with a completely opposite power, he fiercely poured it into it. After he finished doing all that, he finally couldn't withstand the suppression of the explosion anymore. His body felt light, and his entire body suddenly exploded. However, as he exploded, the shock wave that could have destroyed more than half of the central mainland completely disappeared with a soft poof. It only left behind a deep pit that felt like it had directly penetrated the state of chaos. Clearly, even though he had forcefully poured the opposite power into the explosion to neutralize the power within, the power that Duan Ji grasped was still a little weaker than the power of the explosion. Therefore, he had only managed to neutralize the majority of the power within the explosion. There was still a small portion of the power that charged into the ground and created such a deep cave. After a long time, countless fine smoke condensed again and turned into Duan Shi's figure. Although his body was crushed by the impact, his spirit still existed, and his will was still intact. He didn't die because of it. At this moment, he had already recovered his figure after condensing again. It's a pity that all the power has been used up. Duan Shi looked at the deep pit in front of him, then at Luo Fan's various arrangements that had dimmed down. He could not help but feel that it was a pity. However, he quickly calmed himself down. Although his teacher's arrangements were no longer effective, the situation of this world had already undergone an earth-shattering change. At this moment, the power that the Supreme Alliance used to resist the Chaos Alliance had been released. They could now use all their power to fight against the Overlord Alliance. Moreover, the baleful aura that was originally formed by the Overlord Alliance and the Chaos Alliance had collapsed, and the pressure on this world had weakened by 1,000 times. Under such circumstances, even without the various arrangements left behind by Luo Fan, Duan Shi was confident that he could help this world achieve victory. With this realization, Duan Shi soared into the sky and headed toward the northeast, where the Overlord Alliance was located. At this moment, the overlords of the Overlord Alliance had gathered in one place like a huge baleful sun. They stirred up the boundless baleful aura in this world, commanding all living beings, matter, energy, and everything else that was affected by the baleful aura. Under such circumstances, it couldn't be easier to find them. Although the central mainland was vast and boundless, spanning billions of light years, it was just a matter of a thought for someone like Duan Shi to cross it. In just a breath's time, Duan Shi had already arrived in front of the huge baleful sun. Upon arriving, he could feel the endless baleful aura surging into his body. It was trying to break through his body's defenses, rush into his body, corrode him, and assimilate him. It brought him immense pressure. Faced with such a situation, Duan Shi frowned. This was even more exaggerated and dangerous than before. At a glance, the nearest fortress had already dimmed. Even the majority of the fortress itself had been corroded by the killing intent. It was faintly about to completely turn into a part of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. If only the end of the world was a little slower. Fortunately, the calamity of the world was triggered in advance, so the situation was a little stiff. Duan Shi couldn't help but feel lucky. Chapter 2376. Although he was secretly glad that the calamity had been triggered in advance, Duan Ji did not stop his actions. After all, even if he couldn't display the various profundities of the ominous aura, the great tribulation of the world was still a great tribulation of the world. Just this stiff performance alone was enough to cause irreversible consequences if one ignored it. As such, Duan Shi quickly made his move. His figure flashed, and a mysterious light was emitted from his body, directly entering the fort that was gradually being assimilated. As the light from his body was injected, the fortress buzzed. Following that, the feeling of being assimilated began to weaken, as if the fortress's consciousness had suddenly awakened. At the same time, the many fortresses in the area began to change the direction of their power. The fortress that was initially facing the chaotic alliance in the southwest was now facing the fortress that was being attacked by the overlords. In fact, these powers were the main force that was resisting the invasion of the murderous aura. Duanji's power had only stopped the invasion from continuing. However, the injection of these powers instantly erased the influence the murderous aura had on the fortress. The fortress once again emitted the mysterious light and began to repel the boundless murderous aura in the surroundings. Duanji was secretly delighted when he sensed the power. He immediately controlled the powers to charge at the overlords according to his will. In the blink of an eye, the powers sliced through the murderous aura and pierced into the place where the overlords were gathering. Crack, 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 terrifying explosions that shook the heavens and earth came from the place where the overlords were gathering. Amidst the explosions, the entire area began to tremble. The endless murderous aura that filled the area was stirred up in an instant, as if some kind of drastic change was brewing inside the murderous aura. The overlords had lost their consciousness. To them, following the rules of the calamity and destroying everything in the area was their greatest mission. Apart from that, everything else, including their own safety, was insignificant. Hence, at this moment, even though they had suffered such a blow, they still did not care. They only focused on controlling the baleful aura to continue what they had been doing. They attacked the complete system formed by the many fortresses, attacked the laws of the world, and attacked the great Tao that existed in the darkness. However, the power of this world that was bombarding them did not pay any attention to it at all. Duan was overjoyed to see this. As expected, the great tribulation of the world has fallen into an absolute disadvantage. Now, it has placed all its energy on a higher level and no longer cares about this place. Compared to other cultivators, he was able to see many things that other cultivators couldn't. He knew what had happened in this world just now. Many of the overlords in the alliance of overlords had practically turned into mechanical puppets. In the face of Broken Era, who could gather most of the power of the entire world, defeat was just a matter of time. At this moment, high up in the void, in a place no cultivator could sense apart from Luo Fan, the battle between the vortex formed by the will of the world and the origin of the great calamity had reached a white-hot stage. The source of the entire tribulation had already been pulled in by the vortex. Boundless sources of energy gathered towards the vortex from all over the world. They were thrown into the conflict with the vortex, and they were constantly being consumed in the process, causing the source of the tribulation to become weaker and thinner in the process. In fact, this was also the reason why the murderous aura that filled the world was becoming stiffer and the life forms that were being corroded by the murderous aura were becoming more and more mechanical. Compared to the origin of the great calamity that was constantly being damaged, the will of the world wasn't doing much better. At this moment, it was also constantly being damaged in the battle with the heavenly tribulation. At every moment, there would be strands of bizarre existences surging out from the depths of the vortex. They were thrown into the battlefield with the source of the heavenly tribulation, and they were completely exhausted along with the source of the heavenly tribulation. At this moment, the vortex was much dimmer than it was at the beginning, and there was an indescribable feeling of weakness being released from it. If the vortex and the origin of the great calamity were both life forms, then at this moment both sides were like patients that could take their last breaths at any time. What would happen next was to see which of the two patients would be able to hold on faster, and which one would be able to hold on longer. Clearly, what Luo Fan was waiting for was the moment the result came out. This last breath was extremely important to both the great calamity and the will of the world. Therefore, it was impossible for both sides to swallow their breaths so easily. Because of this, the opportunity that seemed to come at any time made Luo Fan wait longer than he had imagined. Nearly 10,000 years later, when the world below had completely calmed down and the baleful aura in the world had thinned to the point that it was almost non-existent, the world had even gradually recovered its vitality, and the number of living beings had gradually increased. Only then did the final opportunity finally arrive. At this moment, both the vortex formed by the will of the world and the origin of the great calamity had scattered like smoke. The battle between the two high up in the sky was more like two clouds colliding, corroding, and killing each other. The difference between the vortex and the origin was so small that it was almost non-existent. At this moment, the two suddenly erupted with the most powerful attack in the past 10,000 years. The source of the great tribulation of the heavens and earth suddenly gathered all the baleful aura in the world, causing the already thin baleful aura in the world to disappear in an instant. The baleful aura condensed in the origin of the great calamity and began to compress and transform. In the end, it turned into a pitch-black and even more terrifying bolt of lightning. This bolt of lightning broke through the barrier of the void, causing the highest point of the void to be instantly imprinted in the eyes of the countless surviving beings in this world, aside from Luo Fan, who was originally unable to see it, to be instantly imprinted in the eyes of the countless surviving beings in this world. In an instant, poof, 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 countless living beings fell to the ground in an instant. There were even those whose reactions were too sharp and whose endurance was too weak. Their heads even exploded and they died a violent death. What is this? At this moment, Duan Shi, who had already moved the Supreme Palace to the central continent, looked up at the bolt of lightning and coughed up blood as he growled. Ever since the Overlord Alliance was destroyed 10,000 years ago, the situation in this world had become better and better. Although the world seemed to have been greatly depleted, causing much of its vitality to disappear, the power of the disaster had weakened, allowing the world, which was on the brink of collapse, to gradually recover, allowing the surviving beings in the world to catch their breaths. It was precisely because of this that he decided to move the Supreme Palace from the depths of the void to the central continent. Among the 3,000 cultivators who had survived, hundreds of them were sent out by him to various parts of the world to constantly display their powers, such as creating vitality, repairing rules and laws, calming the chaos of time and space, and so on. They did everything they could to help this world recover from the destruction caused by the great calamity. It was also because of their hard work that this world was able to recover to its current state without the help of the world itself. The number of living beings in this world had increased by hundreds of thousands of times compared to 10,000 years ago. Although it was still many times less compared to before the calamity, it was already prosperous enough. It was because he had put in so much effort for the restoration of this world that he was so resentful when he saw the world-destroying lightning appearing in the sky. Translator. Zephizi Editor. As soon as the world-destroying bolt of lightning appeared high up in the void, the entire world began to shake violently. Even the great Tao seemed to be unable to withstand it at this moment. It shook and cracked at the same time. The Great Tao defined everything in this world. The changes of the Great Tao were naturally reflected in this world. In an instant, the entire world was in chaos and destruction was everywhere. The fruits of Duan Shi's and the others' hard work over the past 10,000 years were erased at an unimaginable speed. The entire world began to head towards the most tragic state of the great calamity. At this moment, an indescribable vortex quickly formed in front of the world-destroying thunderbolt. As the vortex formed, an unimaginable suction force began to take effect on the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt couldn't resist the suction force at all. It was stripped off bit by bit and thrown into the vortex, where it was quickly devoured by the vortex. Every time it devoured a bit of the thunderbolt, the vortex would release strands of strange existences, and it seemed to weaken a little. This change had obviously caused the thunderbolt to change. The thunderbolt instantly changed its direction and charged into the depths of the vortex. The thunderbolt had already caused the entire world to be unable to withstand it when it didn't move at all. Countless living beings had died. At this moment, it had activated its power and unleashed a powerful attack. This was obviously a greater disaster for all living beings. At this moment, even Duan Shi couldn't withstand it. His entire body exploded and turned into a mist of blood. Although he wasn't dead yet, he was heavily injured. It would take a long time for him to eliminate the destruction that erupted from within his body and reform his body. If even Duan Shi was in such a state, the other cultivators were even worse off. Among the 3,000 cultivators who had survived, more than half of them were completely destroyed. Only a small portion, like Duan Shi, managed to preserve their lives even though they were destroyed. It was just that they couldn't reform their bodies for the time being. As for the cultivators who didn't collapse, in other words, the weaker ones, they were much luckier. They directly fainted, just like ordinary living beings. The reason why the bodies of the powerful exploded, while the bodies of the weaker ones remained intact and only fainted, was actually very simple. That was because the senses of these weak cultivators weren't sharp enough. They couldn't receive too much information about the destruction released by the apocalyptic thunderbolt when it began to move. It was precisely because they couldn't receive too much information about the destruction that the impact they suffered wasn't as strong. Therefore, they only fainted and didn't suffer the same fate as the other experts, whose bodies shattered under the impact. Everything that happened in this part of the world had no effect on the battle taking place in the sky. At this moment, the bolt of lightning had already blasted into the center of the vortex and entered it completely. As the bolt of lightning entered, the vortex began to emit a black brilliance from inside out. The brilliance grew stronger and stronger. It was originally faintly discernible, but it gradually became stronger and more dazzling. The vortex itself began to tremble as the brilliance grew stronger. The structure of the vortex was constantly collapsing during this process, but under the effect of the vortex's own power, it condensed again with great difficulty, trying its best to avoid the fate of collapsing. During this process, cracks began to spread from the center of the vortex in all directions. Gradually, they filled the entire vortex, making it look like it was formed by the accumulation of countless cracks. From the depths of these cracks, strands of black light continuously seeped out. These black lights were the light that had seeped out from the depths of the vortex. However, compared to the light that had seeped out from the vortex itself, the light that had seeped out from the cracks was thousands of times more intense. If the light that had seeped out from the vortex itself was said to be dazzling to ordinary cultivators, then the light that had seeped out from the cracks was enough to poke 2 bloody holes in the eyes of any cultivator below the false saint realm. These cracks continued to increase and expand. In the end, they densely covered every inch of the vortex, making it look like the vortex was going to collapse in the next instant. At this moment, the entire world violently shook. Endless power was constantly being released from the depths of the great Tao. Through some indescribable mysterious channel, it continuously poured into the vortex and mended the countless cracks on the vortex. As these changes occurred, the cracks on the vortex began to close after reaching a certain limit. Chapter 2377. In the end, with a muffled sound that sounded like a sigh, all the cracks closed completely. The black light from the depths of the vortex also disappeared completely, as if it had never appeared in the first place. At this moment, the vortex also became extremely dim, as if it was going to collapse completely in the next moment. In contrast to this change, the entire world seemed to have been hollowed out. There was fatigue and emptiness everywhere, and the colors that existed in the eyes of living beings had become extremely dim. However, only Luo Fan discovered this change in the world at this moment. Apart from Luo Fan, all other living beings had either fainted or died due to the aftermath of the battle between the apocalyptic thunderbolt and the vortex formed from the manifestation of the will of the world. At this moment, the only will that was still conscious in the entire world was Luo Fan and the will of the world. If the will of the world could still remain conscious at this moment, as things developed to this point, the vortex formed from the manifestation of the will of the world began to slowly disappear. From the perspective of the ordinary world, it had already gradually disappeared. Even from the highest point in the void, the vortex was gradually disappearing. Clearly, it was returning to the place where only the will of the world could go, to lick its wounds and recover from the damage caused by the battle with the source of the great calamity of the world. It's finally here. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was staying in seclusion, let out a long sigh. In a flash, he had already traversed countless spacetime barriers and arrived at the supreme void, above the vortex formed from the manifestation of the will of the world. After arriving here, boundless light that seemed to be alive seeped out of his body, turning into a bridge in the void that stabbed into the center of the vortex below. At this moment, the vortex spun frantically and an unimaginable power erupted from it, changing the appearance of the highest point in the void and turning it into a boundless starry sky. Whether it was the sky above or the ground below, everything seemed extremely distant, as if it didn't exist at all. An unimaginable binding force came from the surrounding starry sky and directly bound Luo Fan's body. It also bound the light that was emitting from his body, which was like a living thing. Along with this binding force, Luo Fan felt as if his body was bearing the weight of millions and millions of worlds. A feeling of collapse from the inside to the outside swept through all his senses in an instant. At the same time, he also felt that in many other planes that he could sense, his corresponding existences were all enduring the terrifying pressure that he could feel in this plane of reality. This kind of pressure was so powerful and mysterious that it even caused his corresponding existences in many layers to creak and begin to show signs of cracking from the inside out. Obviously, if there were no deviant interference, regardless of whether it was the plane of reality or the existence corresponding to many other planes, he would eventually be thrown back to the plane of existence and even die. This was the resistance of the world's will, even if it was on its last breath due to fighting against the source of the world's calamity, and it seemed that it was extremely difficult for it to even maintain its own existence. It was still not something that a cultivator like Luo Fan, who had not become a true sage, could resist. At this moment, the world's will only needed to exert a little bit of resistance, and he was already in a state where life and death were hanging by a thread. However, since Luo Fan dared to make a move at this moment, it was obvious that he did not place all his hopes on the possibility that he could resist the world's will's resistance. In that instant, in the face of unimaginable pressure on his corresponding existences across many planes, he didn't think about how to protect himself at all. Instead, he frantically urged the bridge that was condensed from the light that was like a living creature. This lifelike light was none other than the light of the world. Although the light of the world was also oppressed and restrained by the power released by the world's will, its performance was many times better than Luo Fan's. Whether it was in this plane of reality or in many other planes, the light of the world completely ignored the power released by the world's will and continued to fiercely pierce into the center of the vortex formed by the world's will. In the blink of an eye, it had completely pierced into the vortex formed by the world's will and directly collided with the world's will. At this moment, the vortex shook violently, and the power released from the vortex, which was aimed at Luo Fan no matter what plane he was in and was oppressing and crushing his corresponding existences, also shook along with it. This kind of oppression alone was enough to make Luo Fan feel like he was about to be crushed. Now that it shook, the attack power skyrocketed by who knew how many times. In just an instant, his body in the plane of reality, the concept of existence in the plane of concept, the source of karma in the plane of karma, and even the corresponding existences in many other planes rapidly collapsed at this moment. Hurry, hurry, hurry! The consciousness that had fused with the light of the world was frantically urging the light of the world. At this moment, it could be said that he was already racing against time with the world's will. If the world's will completely erased his corresponding existences in all planes before the light of the world completely refined the world's will, then what awaited him would be a true and impossible death. On the contrary, if the light of the world could completely refine the world's will before the world's will completely erased his corresponding existences in all planes, then the situation would be the complete opposite. The world's will would truly be under his control, and this world would also truly be under his control. Not only would he be able to escape the danger of death, but he would also no longer be bound by the world's shackles and finally transcend this world and escape this tribulation. It would only be a matter of time for this fragment of the world's test for him. It could be said that he was currently one step away from heaven and one step away from hell. As for why the light of the world could refine the world's will, the reason was even simpler. This was because the light of the world itself already contained the world's will that completely belonged to Luo Fan. In terms of strength, this world's will was far inferior to any world's will. However, it was the world's will after all. In terms of quality, it was completely on the same level as any world's will. This quality made the light of the world a threat to the true world's will. In other words, to the world's will, if its opponent was Luo Fan, no matter how Luo Fan attacked or destroyed it, Luo Fan would not be able to do anything if it did not resist. However, if the world's will was facing the light of the world, it would not dare to do so. This was because the light of the world contained the world's will. If the true world's will resisted, the light of the world would naturally be no match for it since it was much stronger than the world's will contained within the light of the world. However, if the world's will dared to resist as it did against Luo Fan, then the light of the world would have the ability to grind away the world's will. This was the consequence of having the same quality. This was also the reason why Luo Fan dared to attack the world's will at this time. After all, if it was him, he would not be able to do anything even if the world's will was almost completely destroyed during the battle against the Great Calamity. No matter what method he used, he would not be able to harm the world's will, let alone refine and control it. However, it was completely different with the light of the world. The world's will contained within the light of the world could already threaten the world's will. As long as the world's will was weakened to a certain extent, the light of the world would have a chance to obtain the final victory. Naturally, these facts did not appear in Luo Fan's mind at this time. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly urging the light of the world, doing his best to guide the light of the world to refine and control the will of the world that was attacking this part of the world. Luo Fan didn't understand the existence of the will of the world at all. At this moment, even though the light of heaven and earth completely belonged to him, and the will of the world inside the light of heaven and earth completely acknowledged him as the leader, he could only guide it and could not control the will of the world inside the light of heaven and earth to carry out specific attacks. He could not even see or understand the battle between the light of the world and the world's will at all. He only knew that the light of the world and the world's will were engaged in an intense battle within the vortex. Any of the changes between the two exceeded his understanding. No matter how he looked at it or how he imagined it, he could not understand it at all, let alone see the outcome of the battle. Time seemed to pass at an unprecedented slow pace during this process. In the end, when the world's will's suppression of the world's various corresponding existences was about to come to an end, and 99% of the corresponding existences were completely wiped out, all the changes suddenly stopped. The vortex that was trembling violently came to a stop. The entire world also came to a stop. Even the great path in the unseen world came to a complete stop. As for the suppression of the corresponding existences on his various levels, it naturally stopped as well. I've succeeded. An inexplicable joy emerged in Luo Fan's consciousness that had fused with the light of the world. With this joy, the corresponding existences on his various levels began to recover rapidly. for Luo Fan, who had already opened up many layers of his body and connected the corresponding existences of many layers of his body together, as long as the corresponding existences in any layer of his body still existed, then the corresponding existences of all his layers could be restored no matter how thoroughly they were destroyed. Under the counterattack of the will of the world, although 99% of the corresponding existences on the planes had been destroyed, the remaining 0.1% of the planes that still had existences that corresponded to him were enough to save his life. Moreover, because his cultivation had reached the level of a tribulation initiation powerhouse, for Luo Fan, recovering his body, spirit, power, and everything else was just a matter of a thought to him. As such, he was able to recover so quickly that he did not even need time to confirm whether the world's will had completely failed. Among them, the most obvious was that in the real world, his body had reappeared above the vortex in a flash. All of this seemed to take a long time, but in reality, from the moment he appeared above the vortex until his body was destroyed and reborn, the entire process did not even take an instant. If there were any living beings that could see what was happening here, they might not even be able to discover that Luo Fan had disappeared. They could only discover that Luo Fan had only slightly flashed before their eyes. At this moment, the vortex began to emit a strange brilliance from inside out. The brilliance was so mysterious and profound that it looked like a living thing. Not only was it extremely solid, but it also purposefully dispelled the subtle light that was originally released by the vortex, gradually dyeing the vortex with the color of the light itself. As the light was completely replaced, the incomparably mysterious vortex became even more mysterious. As it spun, it looked more and more similar to the image of a rapidly blinking eye. "I've finally succeeded." An indescribable sense of weakness was continuously transmitted into Luo Fan's heart through the world's light. This feeling of weakness was what the world's light was currently receiving, the feeling of the world's will. Under this feeling, Luo Fan felt like it was difficult for him to even breathe, and his heartbeat seemed to be exhausting all of his potential. Along with this feeling of weakness, there was also an endless amount of information. The information was messy and disorderly, or rather, he felt that it was that messy and disorderly. Almost all of it was about the various aspects of the world that were currently happening. Not only did it include the inside of the world, but it also included everything that was happening in the chaotic state that was in contact with the world. Chapter 2379. When the cultivators in the hall heard Duan Shi's words, they couldn't help but be stunned. It had been 1,000,000 years since Duan Shi had been sitting in the palace. To these 3,000 cultivators who would be replaced every few tens of thousands of years, this period of time could be considered as an eternity. As a result, they had unknowingly gotten used to the era breaker's position. In fact, they had already treated the era breaker as a part of the Supreme Hall. Under such circumstances, when they suddenly heard that Duan Shi wanted to leave, they naturally couldn't accept it. However, the power of Duan Shi's divine ability wasn't something the other cultivators in this palace could compare to. No cultivator could stop him if he wanted to leave. In fact, not a single cultivator could stop him before he left. Just like at this moment, when the 3,000 cultivators in the palace wanted to say something, they realized that Duan Shi had disappeared without a trace. There was no longer any trace of his existence in the entire palace. At first glance, it was as if there had never been a cultivator named Duan Shi in the hall. Leader? At this moment, the cultivators finally snapped back to their senses and exclaimed one after another. Waves of perception spread out from their bodies and scanned the palace. Shortly after, when they couldn't find any trace of Duan Shi in the palace, they rushed out of the palace and tried their best to sense Duan Shi's location. Soon, the cultivators' perception swept through the entire civilization circle. It was obvious that they couldn't find Duan Shi, who didn't want to be found. Therefore, they could only continue to spread their perception to the outside world in vain, bringing one civilization circle after another into their range of perception. Their actions made many cultivators and living beings in the surrounding civilization circle feel an indescribable pressure. One must know that the civilization circle in the Supreme Palace was the goal that all civilizations yearned for. Any change that happened here would naturally affect the situation of many civilizations in this world, and even change the status quo of this world. Under such circumstances, the countless senses that spread out from the Supreme Palace at this moment were obviously a sign of a drastic change to them. For some cultivators who had lived for millions of years, this made them wonder if it was a sign of another tribulation. Thinking of this, the reactions of the cultivators became extremely intense. They didn't even care about anything else and started to activate the various preparations they'd made to deal with the next tribulation. For a time, buzzing sounds erupted from all over the world. With this buzzing sound, a strange light was emitted from every corner of the world, enveloping all the civilizations in this world and forming strange areas that were completely isolated from the outside world. This change caused the cultivators who hadn't thought too much about it to wonder if something strange was happening. They wondered if their senses weren't sharp enough, so they hadn't noticed it. This feeling was enough for those cautious cultivators to respond accordingly. Hence, the various preparations of various civilization circles against the calamity were activated on a larger scale. More and more civilization circles were enveloped by various defensive measures, and their connection with the outside world was weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. It could be said that Duan Shi had only left the Supreme Palace, but he had already changed the situation of this world. From a certain point of view, this had already proven the level of his status in this world. Although this world had developed steadily over the past million years, and even the damage from the Great Calamity had yet to be fully recovered, it was still considered a long period of time for ordinary living beings and even ordinary cultivators. After such a long period of time, the various conflicts, karma, and grudges between living beings were innumerable. If the world's will was in control, this might be the best time for the world to completely deal with the karma left over from history. In other words, if the world's will was in control of the situation, then another tribulation would definitely appear in this world. Perhaps it wouldn't be too great, but it would be enough to cause a disaster to all living beings in this world. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan's heaven and earth light, as the world's will of this world, had yet to fully control this world. He did not grasp this good opportunity to deal with the karma. Therefore, although many of the civilizations in this world would make use of this good opportunity to attack the civilizations that they coveted, feared, or had a grudge against, they were all localized and did not truly merge into a tide. It could be predicted that such a war would end in 100 years at most. After all, if they did not merge into a tide, both sides of the war would definitely be rational. And this rationality was enough for them to choose the most beneficial method after weighing the gains and losses, which was to stop the war. However, this was a story for another time. At this moment, the cultivators in the Supreme Palace searched for a long time. Some of the ones with the strongest senses had even included tens of thousands of civilizations in their senses, but they still could not find any traces of Duan Shi's existence. The Alliance Master really left. A cultivator who was about to become a false saint mumbled. This false saint, who was about to become a false saint, was the Alliance Master before Duan Shi joined this alliance. In other words, he was the strongest back then. Although he was very uncomfortable with Duan Shi seizing the position of the Alliance Master back then and had many opinions about Duan Shi. However, Duan Shi's actions after that made him sincerely convinced. He clearly knew that if not for Duan Shi's guidance and command, their world's losses during that terrifying world calamity would definitely be thousands of times greater than before. In fact, the entire world would be completely destroyed and destroyed. In this way, not only did he not feel any dissatisfaction with Duan Shi, but he also hoped that Duan Shi could stay in this Supreme Palace forever and become the Alliance Master. Now that he saw that Duan Shi had really left, he was naturally extremely disappointed. He even felt that his originally stable heart had become ethereal and had no one to rely on. As he murmured, he sat in his seat in a daze for a long time. At this moment, many other cultivators were also at a loss and a little dazed. In the end, it was the false saint who was about to become a false saint who reacted the fastest. He sighed and said, "The Alliance Master just said that this world is already without tribulations and that there's probably no need for this Supreme Alliance to exist anymore. Take care of yourselves, everyone. Farewell." As he spoke, he stood up and left his seat decisively, leaving the palace. The other cultivators only reacted after he left the palace and exclaimed one by one. Some tried their best to persuade the false saint to stay, some were at a loss, and some were very displeased. The various types vividly displayed the different personalities of different living beings. Among them, many cultivators also shook their heads and left the palace after pondering for a while. In just a few hours, less than 2,000 of the 3,000 cultivators in the palace were left. Many of the 2,000 cultivators seemed extremely hesitant at this moment, as if they wanted to leave the palace but could not make up their minds. It was as if they were worried about something. "They've left, but we can't just ignore this world." At this moment, a seventh-stage false saint spoke. He looked like a young man with a gentle expression. However, there was great ambition hidden in the depths of his eyes, as well as an indescribable greed. Obviously, what he was planning to do was not as noble as he claimed. He was planning to do something more personal and egoistic. After all, the Supreme Palace's strength had been greatly weakened after losing Duan Shi and many other cultivators. However, no matter how weakened it was, the Supreme Palace was definitely the strongest in this world. If one could become the ruler of this Supreme Palace, or rather, the Professional High School Alliance, it would be equivalent to standing at the peak of this world. At that time, although they could not take all the resources in this world, they would definitely be able to obtain them with a difficulty that was 100 times easier than before. In that case, how could this seventh-stage false saint desire to become the alliance leader after thinking this through? At this moment, many cultivators also came to their senses. All of a sudden, the expressions of many cultivators changed. Of course, there were also some cultivators who were hesitant to leave, but they made up their minds and turned to leave the palace. Obviously, they had realized that the palace would no longer be the same from now on. The seventh-stage false saint frowned slightly when he saw the cultivators leaving. One must know that he had almost regarded himself as the alliance leader of this supreme alliance. With such an identity, all the cultivators in the palace could be considered his subordinates and his power. Now that those cultivators left, it was equivalent to betraying him. How could he accept that? Fortunately, he still had some rationality left. Until now, everything was still uncertain. If he tried to stop them, he might be attacked by the other cultivators. If that happened, he would have to face many twists and turns in order to become the alliance leader. Therefore, although he was extremely displeased, he could only watch as those cultivators left. At this moment, another 700 to 800 cultivators left. In the end, out of the 3,000 cultivators, only 1,233 were left behind. When there were so many people left, the real battle began. Those who were able to stay here were obviously cultivators who pursued power. Since they pursued power, they naturally could not just watch as the seventh-stage false saint became the alliance leader. They either directly competed with the seventh-stage false saint for the position of alliance leader, or they began to form groups and formed dozens of camps. They began to plot against each other in the palace to fight for their own position in the alliance. Foul atmosphere. One of the cultivators sighed as he looked at the hall in the distance. He had an indescribable look of disdain on his face. This cultivator was not alone, but had a few people with him. After staying in the palace for over 1,000,000 years, even the most eccentric cultivator would find some like-minded people. Naturally, it was impossible for any of these cultivators to not have any good friends. At this moment, another cultivator with this cultivator sighed and said, "Once the Deputy Alliance leader leaves, no one will have the ability to suppress everyone. I think a split is inevitable. Indeed, I wonder what will happen to this world." Another cultivator sighed. "Ha, no matter what happens to this world, it has nothing to do with us. We have been worrying about this world for so long, now it's time to enjoy a peaceful time." The cultivator who spoke first laughed, and his expression became cheerful. That's right, we don't need to pay attention to those messy things. In any case, the Alliance leader said that there will be no more tribulations in this world. Even if they fight, it won't develop into a tribulation. As long as we don't get involved, it will be no problem for us to stay out of it. Another cultivator laughed. At this moment, everyone had inexplicable smiles on their faces, and the originally heavy atmosphere became incomparably relaxed. "I've already chosen a space-time that is suitable for us to live in seclusion. How about we go there first?" The cultivator who spoke first smiled. Hearing this, everyone smiled and nodded. In fact, all of them had thought about how to survive after leaving the Alliance, and everyone had even found a path. At this time, they did not have to worry about having nowhere to go. Just as they had guessed, the Supreme Alliance in the center very quickly split due to irreconcilable contradictions. Although the entire Supreme Palace was not destroyed during this split, it was thrown into the depths of the void and disappeared from the central continent. The cultivators were divided into more than a dozen factions, each leaving the civilization circle and heading to the other civilizations to subdue them. They were strengthening their own forces there, planning to compete with the others for the position of Alliance leader after doing some business. However, this was clearly only the beginning. As time passed, the inertia of the Supreme Alliance's existence gradually disappeared, and the cultivators gradually realized that there was no harm in splitting. Compared to fighting to the death with other cultivators and standing above everyone to become the Alliance leader of the Supreme Alliance, it did not seem bad to become the ruler of the civilizations they subdued. As a result, hundreds of years later, their desire to form a Supreme Alliance to rule the entire world had unknowingly disappeared. Chapter 2380. When the Supreme Alliance split, Duan Shi had already returned to the depths of the void, back to his palace. He had purposely created this palace to be his personal dojo. Its internal structure had been constantly changing along with his cultivation. Now there was a vast and boundless world inside the palace. There were even living beings and cultivators cultivating and growing. In fact, one could even see many traces of this world within it. When Duan Shi returned to his palace, he swept his gaze across the world inside and frowned. It had been over 1,000,000 years since he had stepped into his dojo. The development of the dojo to this stage was completely based on the rules he had set for the world inside the palace 1,000,000 years ago. Back then, he had naturally thought that the rules were perfect and had reached the limit of what he could achieve. However, after experiencing the great calamity of the world and experiencing 1,000,000 years, he had a new understanding of cultivation and had a new understanding of the world. When he looked at the world again, he felt that it was different from before. Everything that he had thought was perfect and he was secretly proud of was now unbearable to look at. Sure enough, it's impossible to improve if I'm immersed in self-satisfaction. Duan Shi couldn't help sighing after looking at the world for a long time. Then, he threw everything in the outside world to the back of his mind. All of his attention was immersed in the world he had created, and he began to adjust the imperfections in this world. As he adjusted, the entire world gradually changed. For the living beings in this world, it was as if time had suddenly sped up. The changes that should have taken thousands of years to happen now happened in an instant. In just a few short years, the entire world felt like millions or even tens of millions of years had passed. If they hadn't witnessed the changes with their own eyes, they would have suspected that they were in a different world. After spending several years adjusting the world to the way he wanted it to be, Duan Shi comprehended a lot. He directly sealed himself in the center of the world and immersed himself in the depths of the void. He began to cultivate in a state that was close to slumber. As he cultivated, his aura became faintly discernible. The power, might, and divine abilities in his body began to undergo some indescribable transformation, forming an unimaginable sublimation. It could be predicted that when he truly woke up, he would perhaps be completely different from before. In the beginning, some cultivators had paid attention to Duanshu's departure. However, as time went by, more and more cultivators began focusing on matters related to themselves. Or rather, matters related to their own interests. Duanshu's existence was gradually forgotten by the other cultivators. In fact, he didn't even have the chance to become history before he was directly erased. Without the suppression of the Supreme Alliance, the next development fell into a strange state between chaos and stability. The chaos was because there was no strongest force to suppress everything and set the bottom line for the many civilizations in the world. Because there was no powerful force to guarantee this bottom line, many civilizations were willing to wage war against other civilizations for their own benefit. This caused the entire world to fall into an inexplicable chaos. It was as if a war could break out in any place at any time, and any place could be destroyed by any force at any time. As for stability, there was no need to mention it. Living beings had their own rationality. Although they were willing to break any bottom line for their own benefit, they still had their own judgment. On a deeper level, they would still limit themselves so that they wouldn't really cause an all-out war in the world and cause the world to fall into the abyss of destruction. This allowed this world to maintain a faintly discernible stability even in the greatest chaos. The chaos and stability intertwined, making the entire world seem more lively and bustling than when the Supreme Alliance was still around. The civilizations that existed in this part of the world were experiencing great ups and downs almost every moment during this process. However, after the continuous development of the Great Rise and Fall, the structure of many civilization circles had gradually changed, causing some to devour multiple fortresses and expand their own civilization circles by 1,000 times, or even 10 million times. Meanwhile, some civilizations gradually fell into the abyss of failure in the competition, eventually losing their own fortresses, integrating with other civilizations, or directly perishing in the next million years. The development of this world was in a state between chaos and stability. And this state changed after 1,000,000 years, when the first fortress was destroyed in a battle. Before that, no matter how the war went, no matter how the struggle went, the existence of a fortress was the only standard that defined a civilization. It could also be said that a certain bottom line was set for all the civilizations in this world. This seemed unbelievable, but it was actually very simple to explain. After all, there were fortresses left behind in this world that could not be destroyed no matter what level one developed to. They were fortresses that one could not understand at all and could protect one's safety. This would unknowingly plant a kind of reverence in one's heart, a kind of reverence for this world. This kind of reverence could allow the many civilizations in this world to maintain the most basic rationality no matter what level they developed to. It allowed them to clearly understand that they were not really so strong that no power could resist them, and with this understanding, it was enough for them to think about whether their actions would offend the powerful existences that had built this fortress in the first place before making any decision. Would it cause those powerful existences to make a move against him because of this? With this kind of apprehension, they would naturally be limited in their destruction of this world. In the end, no matter what the many civilizations in this world did, they would maintain the most basic bottom line and not cause the entire world to be destroyed. However, when the seemingly indestructible and unshakable fortress was finally broken one day, this perception of theirs would be subverted for the first time. So, we are already stronger than those ancient powerhouses. This kind of thought would involuntarily appear in their hearts. And this would crush the last reverence in their hearts, causing them to finally disregard everything and completely remove the last bottom line. The final result was that the original stable charm that existed in this world was instantly erased, and the entire world directly fell into the final chaos. The destruction of the fortress was like an avalanche that began to spread wildly in all directions from the first fortress that was destroyed, gradually expanding to all the other fortresses in this world. Of course, the destruction of these fortresses was not something that every civilization could achieve. Some civilizations could easily destroy the fortresses of other civilizations, while some civilizations could not shake the fortress even if they came to the front of the fortress and attacked it day and night. This caused the many civilizations in this world to use this as a standard and gradually form another strong and weak division. Those civilizations that had the ability to destroy fortresses unknowingly stood above those that did not have this ability and began to occupy more resources and obtain a higher status, and this caused many civilizations to begin to conduct more in-depth research on how to destroy fortresses. In the end, the fortresses became more and more fragile in the eyes of many civilizations. And once a civilization made a breakthrough in this research, they would do everything possible to test it on the enemy's fortress, announcing to the entire world that they had this ability, and then allowing themselves to step into the upper echelons of the civilization. Just like that, after another 1,000,000 years, the last fortress in this world was also completely destroyed, and there were no more fortresses in this world. With the loss of the last fortress, all the traces left behind by the world's calamity in this world finally disappeared completely. All the cultivators in this world, be it those who had experienced or not experienced the world's calamity, had completely forgotten about the world's calamity. They no longer had any scruples and began to seek their own benefits at all costs. From then on, the entire world fell into a period of total war, without any scruples. When the many civilizations encountered something that did not go their way, they would definitely use their strength to seize it. And this kind of seizure would definitely be met with resistance, and in the end, war would break out. And once the war began, it would naturally begin to spread, and the accumulated conflicts would begin to erupt one after another. The final result was that the scale of the war would far exceed the imagination of the civilizations that started the war. It could be said that at this point, almost any war that was started would eventually end with thousands of civilizations involved. Once the war reached this scale, the accumulation of karma would naturally become faster and faster. The calamity that affected the entire world, that originally had no soil, also gradually gained soil. Time passed slowly, and when it was 10,000,000 years after the world's calamity, the karma that had accumulated in the entire world had become so dense that it had condensed into a murderous aura in the depths of the void. Once the murderous aura was produced, it could no longer be suppressed. It directly erupted and swept through the entire world, causing the entire world to fall into a calamity that affected the entire world. However, because this calamity was the final eruption of the karma that had accumulated in this world for tens of millions of years, it was only targeted at the living beings in this world, and it did not affect the world itself much. Therefore, the worst outcome in the end was that most of the living beings in this world would be consumed, but it would not cause the world to collapse. It was precisely because of this that to cultivators like Duan Shi, this calamity was not considered a calamity at all. Amongst them, besides a few cultivators who lived in seclusion and came out to help the world overcome the tribulation out of pity for the living beings in the world, most of the other cultivators didn't take this tribulation seriously at all, and they continued to cultivate and enjoy as they pleased. The end result was that the calamity in this world had developed to the point where 70% of the civilizations in this world had been destroyed, and the remaining 30% had been mostly destroyed. There was a huge gap between the civilizations before the calamity and what it had been before the calamity had begun. In the end, when the calamity finally passed, it had been almost 100,000 years. As this world escaped from the calamity, the entire world was in a state of desolation. At a glance, there were remnants of cultivators fighting everywhere. There were all sorts of chaotic ruins everywhere. After the calamity that lasted for 100,000 years past, the entire world welcomed a new round of development. Or rather, a new cycle. Just like that, after millions of years, the accumulation of karma had unknowingly developed to a point where it had no choice but to erupt. As a result, another calamity began to erupt. Without calamity and immeasurable? Is this considered without calamity and immeasurable? Hundreds of millions of years after the calamity of the world, when another karma was about to erupt, a cultivator in the depths of space sighed with an extremely heavy expression. That cultivator had participated in almost every calamity over the past hundreds of millions of years. Every time, he would try his best to preserve the vitality of this world, so that the calamity that erupted in this world would not be too powerful, and he would try his best to not lose too many living beings. However, it was a pity that even though he was a pseudo-saint, he was still extremely insignificant compared to the endless karma accumulated by the living beings. Every time, his efforts were basically in vain. He could only watch as the living beings in this world fell into despair as they fought, and in the end, they died in despair. This happened again and again. Up until now, it had already happened thousands of times. There were even a few times when he was almost devoured by the calamity. If it was not for his own cultivation base and the help of his friends, he would have died countless years ago. You want to go again? As the cultivator sighed, a voice appeared in his ears. The cultivator's body trembled. He turned around and saw a woman's figure appearing out of thin air not far away from him. She was looking at him with a worried expression. Seeing the woman, the cultivator sighed. "You're here to persuade me again? You know my answer. I can't just watch as the living beings destroy themselves." Chapter 2381. When the cultivator heard this, he smiled and said, "Every time I participate, I'm prepared to encounter a tribulation. Even if I can't escape this time, I won't regret it." Hearing this, the woman sighed and said, "Is there a need for this?" The cultivator only smiled faintly. The woman looked at him and didn't say anything. Her body slowly dissipated and disappeared. Although this woman had a deep friendship with this cultivator, this friendship was not enough to break through the woman's rationality. Since she had already tried to persuade this cultivator, and this cultivator did not listen at all, she naturally could not let herself fall into a quagmire for his sake. Leaving was inevitable. The cultivator had already expected the woman to leave, so he didn't feel anything. He immediately left the depths of the void and landed somewhere in the central continent. He felt that this location was the source of the greatest destruction this tribulation could cause to all living beings in this world. Just what is it that can destroy all living beings in this world? This thought flashed through the cultivator's mind when he arrived above the city. In his spiritual eye, there was a dense baleful aura in the depths of this city. It was so dense that it covered the entire city. This baleful aura was faintly discernible. If it wasn't for the fact that he was too familiar with tribulations, perhaps even he wouldn't have been able to detect the existence of this baleful aura. Once this baleful aura erupted, it felt like it could drag the entire world into a dark abyss. Such a terrifying baleful aura was hidden in the depths of the city, and it was surging slightly. The cultivator felt an indescribable shock when he saw it. His eyes flickered as everything in the city flowed into his mind. So it's that person's legacy. It's been passed down for more than 3,000 generations, and the entire city has been destroyed and rebuilt more than 43,200 times. There are as many as 300 quadrillion living beings in the city. The amount of karma gathered. After looking at the city's history and development for a long time, a look of shock appeared on the cultivator's face. There's so much karma. This city is still so prosperous even though it's surrounded by so much karma? This thought flashed through his mind. According to his deduction, The karma that this city had accumulated since ancient times was enough to completely erase all traces of this city from this world. But now this city still existed. Moreover, it seemed to be inexplicably prosperous. Even the repeated destruction and rebirth seemed to be continuously tempering the city, making it improve again and again. This went against the cultivator's knowledge and completely overturned his view of karma. How could he not be shocked? As he searched, more and more details of the city began to appear in his mind. Soon, an invisible, mysterious thread spread out from every living being in the city. The thread intertwined in the void and eventually turned into a mess. It was none other than the karmic connection between all the living beings in the city. The chaos of the countless karmic connections had reached the limit of this creature's imagination, surpassing all the karmic connections he had seen before. Looking at the chaotic karmic connections, the cultivator could not help but frown. The karmic connections were actually so chaotic. It was as if all the living beings in the city had been tightly intertwined for generations. Every living being had countless grudges against every other living being that could only be seen in novels or movies. It seems like this is the root cause. This thought flashed through the cultivator's mind as he looked at the countless messy karmic connections. With this thought, he began to randomly find a living being and trace the karmic connections back. He wanted to find the end of all the karmic connections and find the root cause that caused them to develop to this stage. This process was not easy. If it was an ordinary quasi-saint, it would probably take him tens of millions of years to figure it out. After all, the karmic connections were constantly developing. After a while, the karmic connections would undergo some indescribable changes. As a result, the diviner would need to observe and deduce again to find the truth. Fortunately, this cultivator was not a quasi-saint. He was a pseudo-saint. Moreover, he was a rank 7 pseudo-saint. An existence at this level was billions of times stronger than a quasi-saint. Although it was not easy for him to figure out the network behind the countless karmic connections, it was tens of thousands of times easier than a quasi-saint. In the end, it only took the cultivator 10 days and nights to trace the karmic connections back to the end. He found the core of the karmic connections and the source of the chaos. It was an extremely ordinary-looking beggar that existed in this world. The beggar was currently lying in an extremely dirty alley in the northwest side of the city. At this moment, the beggar was quietly sleeping in a corner. His body exuded a strong stench, and his clothes were tattered. In the cultivator's spiritual eye, among all the living beings in the city, the one with the most overlapping karmic connections was this beggar. No matter which living being it was, the beggar had all the karmic connections that could be imagined. They could be husband and wife, father and son, mother and daughter, enemy, benefactor, relative, good friend, etc. Because of these complicated karmic connections, the beggar had become the core of the entire city in terms of karma. Any change he made was sufficient to stir up the karma of the entire city and affect the boundless baleful aura that filled the city. Just as the cultivator was observing the beggar, a pained expression suddenly appeared on the beggar's face. Immediately after, countless goosebumps appeared on his body. Through his spiritual eye, he could see that the boundless baleful aura had started to churn, as though there was a terrifying power stirring up the baleful aura. The karmic connections that were already in a mess started to become more and more chaotic. Many of the connections that originally existed were suddenly severed. Karmic connections could not be severed at will. Once the karmic connections were severed, there would definitely be some kind of backlash. For powerful cultivators who could sever their own karmic connections, this kind of backlash was nothing. The benefits of completely severing the karmic connections were not worth mentioning compared to this backlash. However, for those existences whose karmic connections were severed by external forces and not by their own abilities, this kind of backlash was a calamity. At this moment, countless people in the city were filled with baleful aura and their mentalities started to change. Among them, The one who changed the most was the beggar in an alley on the northwest side of the city. He was the existence with the closest karmic connection to everyone in the city. Any change that occurred to a living being and the severing of the karmic connections between living beings would eventually cause a portion of the backlash to gather at his location. As a result, the strength of the backlash that the beggar would face could be imagined. Under such changes, the beggar's changes became more and more intense. In such a state, how could he still maintain that state of deep sleep? He had already crawled up and was screaming in pain as he rolled on the ground. It has begun. At this moment, an extremely ugly expression appeared on the cultivator's face. Boom, 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 thunderous booms reverberated in the sky, pouring into the cultivator's eardrums. The deafening sound of thunder caused the cultivator to involuntarily shift his gaze away from the city. As far as the eye could see, plumes of smoke began to rise from all over the world. The originally hidden baleful aura began to materialize and continuously rushed out from the ground, turning into pillars of smoke that soared into the sky. Gradually, the originally clear sky was dyed into a dusky appearance. The development of the tribulations in the other regions was not much different from the previous tribulations. If it wasn't for the changes happening in the city, although he was worried, he definitely wouldn't have given up everything. Just as he was thinking this, an unparalleled power suddenly erupted from below. Crack, the loud rumble covered the sky and earth, making the cultivator feel like the entire world was violently shaking. In an instant, countless rays of light covered his body, completely isolating him from the outside world. He was completely protected from the impact of the sound waves and the terrifying shock waves that came along with the sound waves. After protecting himself, he lowered his head and looked down at the city below. With a glance, he saw that the beggar that was rolling on the ground had already exploded, turning into countless fine black powder. As if it was alive, it began to spread in all directions. An aura of extinction was released from the black mist. Even though the cultivator was a rank 7 pseudo-sage, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fear when he saw the black mist. I must stop it. At this moment, this thought flashed through the cultivator's mind. With this thought, he brazenly attacked. A ray of light blasted down and directly enveloped the black mist. Squeak, a strange sound came from the black fog. Then, the black mist suddenly disappeared from the eyes of living beings and entered a domain that only spiritual eyes could see. In the eyes of the cultivator, the black mist directly seeped into the connection of karma and the surrounding ominous aura. Then, it began to spread through the entire city along with the ominous aura. In the blink of an eye, all the creatures within the range of the black fog experienced the same change as the beggar. As these changes occurred, the living beings exploded one by one, turning into powder and turning into the black mist. Then, along with the black mist, it began to spread along the connection of karma and the ominous aura. At this moment, the ray of light that the cultivator emitted, containing boundless power, landed in the city and directly smashed into the place where the black mist was. However, although the ray of light could shatter the void and shatter laws and laws, it was as if it didn't exist when facing the black mist. The ray of light had already swept past the black mist, but it didn't touch the black mist at all. It felt as if they were in a completely different dimension from the black fog. How is this possible? The cultivator's expression changed drastically. Although he expected that the black mist wouldn't be easy to deal with, he never thought that it would be so difficult to deal with. He couldn't even touch it, let alone deal with it. If that was really the case, how should he deal with the black mist? How should he stop it from spreading? Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration. With a thought, he began to refine the ray of light he emitted. He refined the power contained in the ray of light, allowing the ray of light to gradually advance to the level of the connection of karma. During this process, the connection of karma in the city began to be affected by the ray of light, and it became more and more distorted. As for the black mist, He was finally able to come into contact with it. He began to continuously attack the black mist, wanting to completely erase it. However, it was a pity that the black mist was very slippery. Even though the ray of light was so overwhelming and powerful, when it attacked the black mist merely slid away. It wasn't affected at all. On the contrary, a large portion of the connection of karma was severed under the attack. The connection of karma itself was an indescribably mysterious thing. Severing the connection of karma was not as simple as severing a thread. It was one's ability to sever the connection of karma, and there would only be some backlash. However, if one severed the connection of karma with others, it would be complicated. Not only would there be a backlash, but severing the connection of karma was also equivalent to establishing a connection of karma between the two parties who had severed the connection of karma. After all, there was a connection of karma. Naturally, there would be karma when there was a connection. If one severed the connection of karma with others, it would clearly create a connection with both parties. Naturally, a connection of karma would be established. At this moment, the cultivator's power had severed so many connections of karma, which was equivalent to establishing a connection of karma with a large number of living beings in the city. Just this little change caused the cultivator to completely lose his detached status and be included in the messy network of karma in the city. In contrast, the backlash of severing the connection of karma was nothing to the cultivator. At this moment, the cultivator was shocked when he discovered this change. Chapter 2382. The moment he was enveloped by the black fog, the cultivator felt an unimaginable danger engulfing his body. It made him feel as if he had returned to the time when he was facing the cruel nature before he started cultivating. Boom, 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 boom. Explosions occurred in his body one after another. Wisps of black fog seeped out of his body and quickly gathered into the endless black fog that covered his body, causing the black fog to grow stronger with every passing moment. Along with this change, endless negative emotions surged crazily from the bottom of his heart. These negative emotions came in all shapes and sizes. Most of them were the regrets, pains, and defeats he had experienced in his life. But apart from this, there were also many other strange scenes that he was completely unfamiliar with that kept appearing out of thin air in his heart in a trance. He felt as if he had fallen into an infinite hell, and he was suffering all the torture and suffering that could be thought of in the world at every moment. This is the karma of all living beings. At this moment, a light suddenly burst out from the depths of the cultivator's heart, allowing him to find a little clarity in the impossible. With this clarity, he made a prompt decision and instantly severed all the karmic connections between him and the outside world. As a rank 7 pseudo-saint, he already had many ways to deal with karmic connections. It was not difficult for him to sever the karmic connections. In fact, the reason why he did not sever all the karmic connections and still left many karmic connections on himself was not because he could not do it, but because he was unwilling to do it. After all, the existence of karmic connections was not just a restriction, but also a kind of shackle. This kind of shackle was not meaningless for most cultivators. Any cultivator would eventually have some shackles that they were unwilling to completely sever. Just like this cultivator, there were many karmic connections that he was unwilling to take the initiative to sever. It was because of this that he originally had so many karmic connections on him. However, the current situation clearly made it impossible for him to maintain his original thoughts and keep the many karmic connections. Under his means, the karmic connections on his body were severed one by one. Among them, he deliberately kept a portion so that the karmic connections would last forever. However, most of it came from the many living beings in the city. It was the karmic connection that he had attracted just now. The karmic connections that he wanted to preserve had been severed, so he naturally felt a sense of loss. It was as if his heart had been hollowed out. On the other hand, the severing of the karmic connections from the city made him feel indescribably relaxed. It was as if the hundreds of millions of tons of burden on his body had been completely lifted in an instant. As the karmic connection was severed, the negative emotions that erupted from the depths of his heart began to rapidly weaken. All sorts of strange images that appeared out of thin air in his heart began to quickly dissipate. In just a short span of a few breaths, his mind had completely recovered its clarity, and all the hardships that had happened before seemed like a lifetime ago. Only at this moment did the cultivator reveal a look of lingering fear. With a jolt of his body, the black mist that seemed to be attached to his body completely dispersed. As the black mist dissipated, more than half of his body also dissipated. It was not the left, right, or up and down half, but the inside and outside half. In other words, at this moment, the surface of his body had lost half of its thickness, and he looked unimaginably miserable. It looked like he had been swallowed by a ferocious beast, digested, and then spat out again. Anyone who looked at this kind of creature would feel intense pain from just looking at it. However, at this moment, the cultivator did not feel anything at all. His expression was extremely calm and indifferent. With a slight thought, the power in his body trembled, and his body began to rapidly regenerate. In the blink of an eye, he had returned to his original appearance, as if nothing had happened. If there was anything different, it would be that his aura had weakened a little at most. At this moment, the surrounding mist had already left his body and began to spread throughout the city along the messy karmic connections. It devoured and assimilated the nodes in the karmic connection network, which were the living beings, and turned them into a part of the black mist. The more the black mist devoured and spread, the stronger it became. The speed at which it spread became faster and faster, and the speed at which it devoured the living beings also became more and more shocking. The city was extremely huge, and there were more than 100 million living beings in it. Compared to the entire world, or rather, the entire central continent, so many living beings were naturally nothing, but in terms of absolute numbers, it was not a small number. However, at this moment, in just a few dozen breaths, all the living beings in the city had been completely devoured and assimilated by the black mist. In the end, they completely became a part of the black mist, causing it to grow several tens of thousands of times stronger. It directly enveloped the entire city, and like an illusory strange beast, it rolled about in the air and searched. From the looks of it, it seemed to be searching for a path, looking for a direction to move forward. We must imprison him. At this moment, the cultivator hovering in the air, who was almost devoured by the black mist, revealed an extremely strong determination. Although he could not completely understand the nature of the black mist, through his previous observations and senses, he already knew how dangerous it was. If the black mist was really allowed to spread in all directions without any obstruction, then all the living beings in the world would be devoured, and in the end, there would be no more living beings in the world. To him, this outcome was only a step away from the destruction of the world. He knew that if he directly came into contact with the black mist, he would definitely be completely devoured by it. Therefore, although the cultivator had a strong determination to completely stop the black mist, he clearly knew that if he wanted to achieve his goal, he could not foolishly charge forward. At that moment, his thoughts spun at lightning speed. Countless thoughts and information began to emerge from the bottom of his heart. In the end, all the thoughts and information converged into a determination that he had to carry out even if he had to pay a huge price. With this determination, he roared, and his body suddenly exploded. He turned into an extremely dazzling light mist, and brazenly charged up. In the process of charging up, the light mist seemed to have turned into a boundless black hole, and it began to madly devour everything in the world. Whether it was matter, energy, time, or space, it also contained the laws of the world. In the process of devouring, the mist started to grow stronger and expand. The area that it enveloped had grown to the point that it had covered the entire sky. It fluctuated in the sky and started to change this space-time. In the process of devouring, the mist started to grow stronger. An indescribable isolation layer appeared at the edge of this area. Its range just happened to envelop the boundless black mist below. This isolation layer was not a simple isolation layer of power, but a kind of isolation layer of heaven and earth. Under the effect of this isolation layer, any connection between this area and the outside world was completely cut off. In other words, under this isolation layer, this area had already formed its own spacetime. It seemed to be just an ordinary area shrouded by the black mist, but in fact it was already an independent spacetime, and it no longer had any connection with the outside world. Boom, 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 boom. The moment the black mist inside the isolation layer came into contact with the isolation layer began to shake violently at this moment. It was as if there was an extremely powerful and terrifying monster constantly struggling in this isolation layer, trying its best to break this isolation layer and obtain true freedom. In the face of this change, a painful roar came from the void. Or rather, it came from the light mist that had constructed the isolation layer. At this moment, the light mist began to shake violently, and thoughts turned into substance and splashed out from the light mist. In the face of these thoughts, the black mist was like a shark that smelled blood. It madly pounced over, directly mincing these thoughts, assimilating them, and devouring them. In the end, not a single thought was left out, and it was completely devoured, disappearing without a trace. From the perspective of the real world, this city had become a dead city, an empty city. Only occasionally would an extremely strange black mist appear in a certain part of the city. After circling around a certain unknown trajectory, it would once again enter the void and disappear without a trace. This added to the strangeness of the four cities. It made the four cities look even more terrifying and horrifying. From the perspective of the outside world, at this moment this city had completely disappeared from this world. The light mist that constructed this isolation layer was completely undetectable by the outside world. Why bother? At this moment, deep in the void, the woman who had previously persuaded this cultivator appeared again. She had a look of pity on her face as she sighed. She was also a rank 7 pseudo-sage cultivator, but she was on par with that cultivator. With this strength, she could see many things that ordinary cultivators could not understand. At this moment, she saw what that cultivator had done at a glance. That cultivator had sacrificed his own essence and forcefully used his own essence to construct a seal that completely sealed the black mist that had been refined from the karmic karma. Of course, such a seal could completely block the black fog within the seal so that the other living beings in this world wouldn't all die because of the black fog. However, for this cultivator, this was clearly not a good thing. After all, what sealed the black mist was the cultivator's essence. Once this essence was affected, it would affect a cultivator from the inside out. Even if this seal was just cast and did not seal anything or any power, over a long period of time, it could cause the cultivator's personality and self to change in all sorts of ways. Moreover, this seal that was constructed by essence was sealing the black mist that was refined from the karma. In such a seal, the black mist was attacking the seal almost all the time. In other words, the seal was being attacked, injured, and suffered losses at all times. In other words, the cultivator's essence was being hurt and suffered losses at all times. In this way, even if the cultivator could completely suppress, erase, and recover the black mist, it could not be said that he was the original cultivator. The price of such a thing was self-evident. It was no wonder that the woman who was friends with the cultivator secretly felt pity. However, even though she felt that it was a pity, the woman did not plan to make a move. After sighing with emotion, her figure once again disappeared without a trace. At the same time, in the depths of the void, there were gazes looking at the seal that the cultivator had constructed. Those gazes were all different, and each gaze contained different emotions. Some were admiration, some were contempt, some were pity, some were sadness, some were disdain, and some were praise. There were all kinds of gazes, showing the huge difference in ideology between cultivators. However, although there were so many different gazes looking at this place, in the end, no one helped this cultivator. Even the cultivator with admiration and praise in his eyes had no intention of helping this cultivator. This choice seemed unreasonable, but it was actually very normal. For these cultivators who had gradually grown up, the most important thing was their own cultivation. Apart from their own cultivation, everything else was embellishment and support. Under such circumstances, how could they affect their own cultivation for something that was only embellishment and support? Didn't they see that the woman who was clearly interested in this cultivator did not participate in this matter? Even the woman was like this, so it was naturally even more impossible for others to help. The tribulation in this world was clearly not fixed in this city. In other areas, the sudden tribulation was developing like a raging fire. At this time, the entire world had completely fallen into a swamp of war. At every moment, tens of thousands of living beings in this world would die a violent death. The smell of blood that soared into the sky simply changed the aura of the entire world. Chapter 2383. In the end, the entire world seemed to be shrouded by extremely thick, dark clouds. Many cultivators in the depths of the void had to exhaust their eyesight to see through the dark clouds and see the world that was shrouded by the dark clouds. Faced with such a situation, the many cultivators who were secretly feeling sorry for the cultivator who had sacrificed himself became solemn. One must know that this kind of ominous aura was much weaker than the ominous aura from the great calamity of the world. However, in terms of quantity, it had already surpassed the ominous aura from the great calamity of the world. With such a terrifying amount of ominous aura, even they could not help but feel inexplicably worried. They were worried that they would be affected by the ominous aura and be dragged into the calamity as well. Back then, the Alliance leader clearly said that this world had no more calamities since the last great calamity of the world. Why is there still such a terrifying calamity? Such thoughts involuntarily appeared in the minds of many cultivators who were watching. For these cultivators, they also had their own understanding of the development of this world and had their own deductions. However, in comparison, they still trusted the original Alliance leader more. In other words, Duan Shi, who was tens of thousands of times stronger than them. Before Duan Shi left, he said that there would be no more calamities in this world and that there was no longer a need for the existence of the Supreme Alliance. This kind of judgment was naturally grasped by them and became a guide for their actions. At this time, they were secretly worried, but in the end, they still did not make up their minds to overturn Duan Shi's judgment. They still did not think that this calamity would affect them. Therefore, they turned around and returned to their own cave abodes or dojos. They closed their doors and treated everything that happened in the outside world as a dream. As they made this choice, the baleful aura that had accumulated in this world continued to increase. In the end, all the living beings in this world were controlled by the ominous aura. They gradually lost their rationality, and all their thoughts were focused on killing. They no longer cared about their own lives, the world, or the fate of the many civilizations that existed in this world. As the living beings in this world changed, the atmosphere gradually changed. The original civilization and rationality were unknowingly completely lost. No matter where one looked, there was only violence, meticulousness, primitive or barbaric killing. Gugu, the baleful aura grew denser and denser. After a few years, it was so dense that it turned into a substance and covered the entire world. It looked as if the entire world had been transformed into a boundless sea of baleful aura. At this moment, all the living creatures in this world looked like creatures living at the bottom of the sea. Their movement was like a school of fish moving at the bottom of the sea. Their killing was like a school of fish fighting each other at the bottom of the sea. Their death was like the death of the creatures at the bottom of the sea. This scene was enough to stun any living being who could still maintain their composure. If there was a creature who could still keep calm and watch all of this, at this moment, the entire world seemed to have turned into a world of black water. If one didn't know what the world looked like a few years ago, they would find it hard to believe that the world looked like a normal world a few years ago. But even at this stage, the ominous aura in the world was still increasing. Endless ominous aura seemed to have appeared out of thin air and kept pouring into the sea of baleful aura, causing the sea of baleful aura to continuously increase and thicken. After several years of development, the ominous aura had almost completely filled every corner of this world. Under such circumstances, the ominous aura was still increasing. This could only force the ominous aura to find a way out and find more space that could accommodate it. In this way, the depths of the void were naturally the last way out for the ominous aura. After all, many cultivators had opened up countless cave abodes, training grounds, and small worlds in the depths of the void to the baleful chi. These existences were simply like new worlds that were waiting to be conquered by him. The concealment and defense measures that these cultivators had set up for their cave abodes and training grounds were naturally quite exquisite. It could be said that they had put in the best of their abilities. However, different cultivators had different strengths. Even if they exhausted all the measures they could set up, their standards would naturally vary. Finally, at a certain moment, the various defensive measures that a minor completion quasi-sage had set up failed under the impact of the ominous aura. For a time, endless ominous aura began to surge wildly into the small world that the minor completion quasi-sage had opened up. In the blink of an eye, the small world was completely enveloped by the sea of ominous aura. At this moment, the minor completion quasi-sage did not even have the time to react. However, it was clear that he did not have the chance to react anymore. This was because the ominous aura had also completely enveloped him and began to crazily invade his body and soul. This invasion caused him to gradually lose his rationality. Countless negative emotions kept surging in his heart, causing his thoughts to gradually draw closer to the many living beings in the sea of ominous aura. Kill! A furious roar came from the cultivator's mouth. Then, the cultivator did not care about the treasures in his small world. He roused all his might and fiercely attacked the cave abode of a cultivator that he had always disliked. The explosion came so suddenly that the cultivator was unable to react in time. A crack was forcibly torn open in his originally tight defensive method. "Are you crazy?" the cultivator roared angrily. His heart was filled with bewilderment. He quickly released his perception, wanting to see what had happened to this cultivator. After all, although he had some conflicts with this cultivator, it was only a small one. Usually, it would be enough for a little scheme or a little quarrel. Why did it have to escalate to a life-and-death battle? However, the moment he released his perception, his expression changed. This was because the boundless ferocious aura was surging toward his dojo like a tidal wave. It slammed into the defense of his dojo and tore open the small crack that had previously appeared. The ferocious aura surged into the crack and swept across the entire dojo. Seeing this, how could the cultivator still have the mood to care about the attacks from other cultivators? In that instant, he unleashed all of his power and might, wanting to block the murderous aura that was rushing towards him. Unfortunately, he had succeeded in the first step. However, it was only the first step. He had indeed blocked the ominous aura outside his body. However, the ominous aura did not stop eroding him. Instead, it began to erode the force that he had set up outside his body. The power continued to spread inside his body and gradually engulfed his entire body, directly changing his mind. Not long after, another cultivator who had been changed by the ominous aura, or could even be said to have been controlled by it, appeared. The cultivator let out a roar and fought the cultivator who had attacked his dojo without hesitation. The two cultivators were of similar strength, so the battle was naturally extremely intense. The impact of the battle was also extremely shocking. The space-time, heaven and earth, dojo, and cave residences in the nearby void were all shaken by their battle. Subsequently, they were discovered by the boundless ominous aura and began to bear the impact of the ominous aura. As their battle became more intense, more space-time, heaven and earth, dojo, and cave residences were affected. As the impact grew stronger, the cultivators who had closed their cave residences and isolated themselves from the outside world could no longer treat everything in the outside world as a dream like before. For a time, senses began to spread from all directions to sense the world and observe the current state of the world. How can this be? How can this tribulation be so powerful? The cultivators were inexplicably shocked. The quality of this tribulation might not have reached the level of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, in terms of quantity, it had far surpassed the level of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. One must know that even the ominous aura that filled the world during the great tribulation of heaven and earth existed in the form of a liquid. It did not have much effect on the depths of the void. At least, it did not have such a direct and violent effect. However, at this moment, the ominous aura of this tribulation had actually liquefied into a liquid state. Moreover, the amount was so great that even the world could not contain it. They actually had to search for a way out of the depths of the void, through the space-time that they had opened up. This situation overturned their understanding of tribulations, causing them to fall into panic. Crack, crack, crack. At some point in time, cracking sounds began to appear in the hearts of the cultivators. Immediately afterward, they discovered that the various protective and concealment measures that the cultivators had set up for their cultivation places were beginning to shatter. The boundless ominous aura began to surge into the cracks and engulf the cultivation places through the cracks. Following this change, a tremendous and violent aura began to erupt from the depths of the cultivation places. Then, the scale of the battle between the cultivators began to expand wildly. One by one, the frenzied cultivators directly joined the battle, and the aftermath of the battle began to increase at a crazy rate. As the aftermath of the battle increased, the impact on the cultivation places of the cultivators began to increase as well. Many of the defensive measures that were already extremely dangerous began to break in just a few days. Most of the cultivators hidden in the depths of the void had been eroded by the ominous aura, assimilated, and turned into the power of the ominous aura. Their battlefield was no longer limited to the depths of the void of this world. Instead, it had begun to affect the normal spacetime of this world, affecting the central continent and the islands in the outer seas that had already sunk into the quagmire of war. The war in this part of the world, that was already extremely tragic, began to become even more tragic. The rate at which living beings died also skyrocketed. The karmic karma that erupted in this part of the world naturally increased, and the growth of the ominous aura did not slow down at all. Instead, it increased at a crazy rate. In the depths of the void, in a palace that almost no cultivators could discover, Duan Shur suddenly opened his eyes that he had not opened for hundreds of thousands of years. He frowned and muttered, "Tribulation. I clearly divined that this world would have no tribulations. Even if there were occasional chaos, it would only be on a small scale. It would never develop into a tribulation. Why is there such a strong aura of tribulation now? It's even making it difficult for me to cultivate?" The thought flashed through his mind, and his expression became even more uncertain. With a thought, he spread out his perception. In the blink of an eye, the situation of the entire world was included in his perception. The moment he saw the situation of the world, Duan Shur's expression changed greatly. How could this be? He suddenly stood up and appeared outside the palace in a flash. He used his own eyes to personally observe the situation of the world. What he sensed was too unbelievable. He had no choice but to observe with his own eyes to confirm what he had sensed. At this moment, the entire world, including all the space-time, heaven and earth, dojo, and cave residences that had been opened up in the depths of the void, were filled with condensed ominous aura. The countless living beings that existed were all eroded and assimilated by the ominous aura. They turned into a part of the ominous aura and were killing each other according to the laws of the ominous aura. The scene made him feel as if he had returned to the time when the great tribulation of the world broke out. "My deduction can't be wrong," he murmured as his eyes flickered. Countless information kept flowing and combining in his mind. The development of this part of the world was revealed bit by bit in his mind. After a long time, his brows furrowed even deeper. According to his deduction, this part of the world was still without tribulations and immeasurable. It would still enjoy peace and stability for a long time, however. This was clearly completely different from what he was seeing. It made him break out in a cold sweat. He felt as if his worldview was gradually being overturned. Why is it so different? What's wrong with my deduction? He murmured, and his expression gradually became frantic. It should be noted that the result of a deduction was a guide to action for any existence that had the ability to deduce. It was a way to reconfirm one's own standard of action. However, at this moment, he discovered that his deduction might be a pile of sh*t. It might be almost the opposite of the truth. How could he not panic? How could he still maintain his original mentality? Chapter 2384. The current situation in this world had completely overturned Duan Shi's deduction. To him, it was equivalent to shaking the foundation of his cultivation. How could he not have such an intense reaction? The frenzied emotions gradually caused wisps of smoke to seep out of his body. The smoke was close to malevolent aura, karma, and karma. As soon as it appeared, it caused a violent reaction in the sea of malevolent aura below, causing the boundless sea of malevolent aura to churn violently. After all, Duan Shi was already an existence that was about to become a supreme emperor. Compared to the other cultivators in this world, he was many times stronger. Even though he was in a frenzied state, the moment the black smoke was released, he suddenly jolted and regained a bit of clarity. These are the countless karma that I've sown in this world in my life? How is this possible? I should have completely severed these karma. The thought surfaced in his mind, and he quickly suppressed the other messy emotions and thoughts in his heart. Any living beings in this world, whether they were as powerful as Duan Shi in despair or as weak as drifters, would inevitably form all kinds of karma with this world and all living beings. This could almost be regarded as the fundamental rule of this world, and it was impossible to avoid it. Among them, there was only one thing that made a powerful cultivator stronger than a weak living being. For a powerful cultivator, they could choose which karma they wanted to leave behind and which karma they wanted to sever. For Duan Shi, when he left the Supreme Alliance back then, he had already severed all the karma that was related to him, allowing himself to cultivate in a relaxed state. Yet now, he'd actually noticed that the karma he thought he'd severed still existed, and it had even erupted in a manner that was a myriad of times more violent than before. It directly caused him to become the source of this tribulation. So, how could he not be shocked? He carefully analyzed it and found that the karma that was connected to him could even be traced back to his previous life, to when he was still a great emperor. Moreover, no matter what kind of karma it was tens of thousands of times more stable than what he had seen in the past. In the past, he could completely sever the karma that was connected to him with just a slight thought, but now, he was not completely confident that he could even sever the weakest karma. This change caused him to fall into a state of bewilderment and helplessness, and his expression began to change. However, he soon regained his senses. This was because he knew that if he continued to fall into negative emotions, the black fog that was released from his body would increase, and in the end, his connection with this disaster would become even closer. No matter what, it's the right thing to do to sever these karma first. This thought emerged in Duan Shi's mind. Along with this emotion, endless brilliance suddenly emerged from his body. It rapidly derived and transformed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless sharp blades, and slashed at the countless karma connections that had been severed in the past but had reappeared just now. These sharp blades contained his strongest power as a desperate one who was about to break through, and contained his deepest determination. Under normal circumstances, even the great Tao of karma would be destroyed in an instant. However, at this moment, the moment these sharp blades slashed at the karma connections only trembled violently. At most, there was a faint buzzing sound. Apart from that, there was no other movement. Just as he'd expected, these karmic connections were so stable that even he was actually helpless against them, and he was unable to sever them. Seeing this, Duan Shi's expression changed slightly. Although he knew that these karma connections were extremely stable, he still felt inexplicably shocked when he confirmed that these karma connections were beyond the scope that he could sever. If he severed the karma connections, the backlash from the severed karma connections would only be within the scope that Duan Shi could bear. It might not even be enough to make his expression change. However, this time, the karma connections were not severed at once. Instead, it produced all kinds of shocks that should not have appeared, causing Duan Shi to suffer a backlash that was thousands of times stronger than normal. At this moment, endless destruction was released from the karma itself and directly poured into his body, causing countless muffled sounds to be heard from inside his body. His internal organs, bones, and muscles were all turned into powder at this moment. The powder rushed out from his pores, and a dark red mist of blood appeared around his body. It was an extremely horrifying sight to behold. Even though he was a desperate one who was about to become a supreme emperor, Duan Shi could not help but groan in pain in the face of such damage. However, even though it was so tragic, his life was still saved in the end as he triggered the karma connections. Wisps of black mist seeped out of his body again. They continuously attracted the sea of evil spirits below, causing the sea of evil spirits below to become more and more violent. Under such a violent state, the evil spirits kept colliding into the depths of the void, trying their best to find a way to enter the layer of void that Duan Shi was in. They wanted to truly connect with the black mist that was released from Duan Shi's body. Faced with such a situation, Duan Shi's expression became even uglier. Not only did his hard work not achieve any results, but it also pushed him further into the abyss of despair. How could he endure this? All of this, what's the reason for this? When Duan Shi realized that he could not directly sever the karma connections, he could only turn around and look for the source of the changes. Endless information, endless principles, and endless lights and shadows appeared in his mind out of nowhere. They were quickly decomposed and transformed, gradually forming one indescribable scene after another, faintly outlining an indescribable outline. The outline of the world. How is this possible? Is this the normal development of the world? The appearance of this catastrophe is inevitable? When the final outline was formed, Duan Shi's expression changed drastically. At this moment, he had even forgotten about his body's recovery. He was only shocked by the result of his deduction. As long as the world existed, there would be countless changes, and these changes would naturally trigger karma. On the other hand, all of this had even arrived at a peak after living beings were born. The accumulation of karmic karma was countless times faster than before living beings were born. In this way, with the passage of time, the karmic karma would one day reach the limit of what the world could endure and erupt. Once the karmic karma erupted, it would affect all existences that contributed the karmic karma. This sort of influence would be reflected in the form of a tribulation, just like this very moment. Although the tribulation this time seemed so terrifying that it even felt like it had surpassed the second tribulation, the scale of the tribulation didn't seem normal if it was calculated according to the karma that had gathered since the birth of the world. If that's the case, what are all the catastrophes that the world has encountered before? The thought surfaced in Duan Shi's mind as soon as it appeared. The thought almost made him fall into a frenzy again. Fortunately, his rationality was strong enough to pull him out of the frenzied abyss at the last moment. However, even though he was pulled back, his mind was still in a mess. All kinds of thoughts kept appearing in his mind, causing his expression to change constantly. Back when he faced the second catastrophe of the world, his strength was much weaker than it was now. However, back then, he could easily lead many cultivators to help the world resist the catastrophe. It was not because his willpower was much weaker than before, but because he clearly knew where the enemy was during the catastrophe. But now, he was completely clueless as to who his enemy was. Was it the world, the karma gathered by the living beings, or the living beings? He could not find the enemy at all. Even if he wanted to help the world overcome the catastrophe, he could not think of a way. What should I do? What should I do? Thoughts kept appearing in his mind, causing his expression to change constantly. After an unknown period of time, when the barrier of the void had become extremely weak against the sea of malevolent aura, as if it would lose its effect in the next moment, a light finally appeared in the depths of Duan Shi's chaotic mind. Teacher. That's right, I still have my teacher. The thought instantly turned his hopeless expression around, and a bit of hope burst out from the depths of his eyes. Ever since he left his teacher's place of seclusion, he had never seen his teacher again. Given his confidence in his teacher, even if the entire world was destroyed, he absolutely believed that his teacher would be able to survive. The fact that he could not find his teacher at all clearly showed that his teacher could still transcend the catastrophe and protect himself in the boundless sea of malevolent aura. For Duan Shi, this situation was like a ray of light suddenly appearing in the boundless darkness, allowing him to find the brightest ray of hope in the deepest despair. In an instant, Duan Shi's eyes flickered, and his perception rushed out of the depths of the void to explore the world. The target of his investigation was not the various situations in this world that he had investigated before. Instead, it was a place that existed somewhere in this world, a place that was unaffected by the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. It was the place where his teacher lived in seclusion. The moment he explored this area, his eyes lit up. This was because he suddenly realized that even though the outside world was filled with condensed and liquefied malevolent aura, it was still not affected at all. Even though the malevolent aura had reached the limit that this world could contain, and he needed to find a way out of the void, this area was still not affected at all. This place was like the only place that existed in this world that could transcend. No matter how violent the malevolent aura in the outside world was, or how much it attacked, this place remained peaceful like it was before Duan Shi left. Why didn't I discover this place before? Duan Shi scolded himself in his heart as he looked at the place that looked like a bright pearl in the darkness. If he had discovered this place earlier, he would not have had to torture himself like this. With a thought, he directly distorted space and time. In a flash, he had already stepped into that region. The area of this area was so insignificant compared to this world, but the area itself could not be considered small. Normally, such a vast area should have been discovered by living beings who had the ability to sense the entire world. However, at this time, whether it was Duan Shi or other cultivators, or even the living beings that had been born and died in this world for tens of thousands of years, none of them had discovered the existence of this area. Even the nearby civilizations could not extend their tentacles into this area. To them, it was like this area did not exist at all. No matter how hard they tried, they could not discover its existence. The reason why Duan Shi was able to discover the existence of this area was because his cultivation was high enough and he had a deep memory of this area. In addition to the current situation, he was forced to do so. Moving through the void was not difficult for Duan Shi. Even if he could not travel through the normal world, he could still easily arrive at this area. He arrived at the thatched hut that Luo Fan used to live in seclusion. The moment he arrived, he felt his body lighten and the sense of despair that enveloped him disappeared completely. It was replaced by an indescribable feeling of comfort. As for the countless karmic connections that connected him, they were completely cut off at this moment as if they had never existed. As for the endless black fog that surged out of his body, it disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. In just a few breaths of time, he looked as if he had transcended the tribulation. This change suddenly made Duan Shi feel like he had been separated from the world. The disdain he had for his teacher, Luo Fan, gradually disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. The gap between me and my teacher is still so huge. Such thoughts gradually emerged in his heart. With this thought, his face became a little flushed. Chapter 2385. This place was supposed to be the place where his teacher lived in seclusion, but now it was empty. Although it still looked so leisurely, so contented and so leisurely, the most crucial existence was missing. His teacher, Luo Fan. This made Duan Shi, who had always thought that Luo Fan would be brought back here, feel an indescribable fear in his heart. He was worried that his teacher was not willing to see him, so he almost lost control of his emotions at this moment. Just when Duan Shi began to let his imagination run wild and even his rationality was about to be blinded by these random thoughts, a sigh suddenly resounded through heaven and earth. This sigh was very strange to ordinary living beings. It was as if the entire heaven and earth were sighing, giving off a feeling that the sigh came from the depths of one's heart and every inch of one's flesh and blood. As for Duan Shi, the appearance of this sigh made his eyes suddenly lit up. This was because at this moment, he clearly recognized that the person who sighed was his teacher, his last hope. Teacher. Hearing the sigh that seemed to come from every inch of his flesh and blood, Duan Shi felt all the despair and negative emotions from before had disappeared without a trace. They were replaced by an indescribable sense of peace. At this moment, he felt like an ordinary person who could not swim had fallen into the sea. Just when he was in despair, a platform suddenly rose from under his feet and directly lifted him up. As for why Luo Fan's sigh appeared in this form, it was nothing to Duan Shi. After all, he simply had blind faith in Luo Fan's strength. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan suddenly became a true saint, to him, the only thing he should be thinking about was how to congratulate his teacher. To Duan Shi, this sigh suddenly made him feel at ease. However, to the other living beings in this heaven and earth, the existence of this sigh had no meaning at all. To the other living beings, this sigh was like a basin of ice water that poured over their heads, causing them to suddenly wake up from their fanaticism, causing their minds that were originally completely covered by baleful aura and drowned in slaughter to suddenly recover a trace of indescribable clarity. What was I doing? Why were there so many corpses around? Why are there so many people who are my enemies? Similar thoughts began to surface in their mind. However, it could only last for a short while. Very quickly, the boundless baleful aura in the surroundings began to invade their hearts once again, completely erasing the little bit of clarity that had just surfaced in their minds. At this moment, all of them had already forgotten the sigh that had resounded in their ears, and they had completely forgotten the many doubts that had appeared in their hearts earlier. At this moment, in the residence of the world will, a place that even Luo Fan would find difficult to locate. Luo Fan had already opened his eyes and was looking at the endless light and shadows around him with an indescribable expression. Compared to before, the range of the light had increased by several hundred times. Furthermore, it was several dozen times brighter than before. From the looks of it, it had already lost its original gloomy feeling. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth had already connected all the light and shadows. It felt as if it had completely turned into the veins of the endless light and shadows. Karma can actually erupt like this. Looking at the endless light and shadows, a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. There was even a hint of comprehension in the depths of his eyes. For so many years, his will had been guiding the light of the world to control this part of the world. He had completely ignored the development of this part of the world, allowing the world to develop freely under the operation of its own laws. It could be said that the development of this world was the result of the interaction between its own laws and laws. The tragic outcome was something that Luo Fan had never imagined. Before this, his thoughts were roughly the same as Duan Shi's. This world no longer had the great tribulation of heaven and earth, nor did it have the will of heaven and earth to guide the birth of tribulations again and again. After the second great tribulation of heaven and earth, there should be no more tribulations, and it should exist in peace forever. However, he did not expect that in less than 100 million years, this world had developed under the operation of its own laws to the point where it was almost destroyed. This situation suddenly made him understand many things that he had not expected before, such as the effects of the will of heaven and earth. The existence of the will of heaven and earth might have more meanings than I expected. With that thought in mind, his body gradually emitted an inexplicable brilliance. The brilliance poured into the light of heaven and earth, causing all sorts of subtle changes to the light of heaven and earth. As the changes occurred, the endless light and shadows in the surroundings also began to move. At this moment, the endless sea of murderous aura that covered the entire world seemed to be suppressed by an invisible force and suddenly froze. The various effects that it had on the living beings in this world also stopped in an instant. However, it was only a pause. The effects it had caused before were still continuing, causing the world to fall into absolute chaos. Shortly after, it was as if a black hole had suddenly appeared in the center of the world. It began to absorb the endless murderous aura like crazy, causing an increasingly large whirlpool to appear in the center of the black hole. As the whirlpool expanded, the sea of murderous aura that filled the entire world began to descend. The first to escape the influence of the sea of murderous aura were the many cultivators' cave abodes, dojo, heaven and earth, space-time. As those areas escaped the sea of murderous aura, the owners of those areas, who were the cultivators, regained their rationality. Everything that had happened before replayed in their hearts, causing their expressions to change indeterminately. They felt a shamed, inexplicable sadness, and indescribable resentment. Resentment towards the world, resentment towards the endless murderous aura. To these cultivators they had always stood at the highest point in the world, looking down on all the living beings in the world. Just now, they had been affected by the murderous aura, and their rationality had been drowned by the murderous aura, causing their hearts to be completely blinded. To them, this situation was simply a naked mockery of the results of their cultivation. How could they not be angry? How could they not feel resentment? Since they had regained their senses, they naturally couldn't continue the battle that they were originally fighting. The chaos in the depths of the void calmed down at an unimaginable speed. Even some of the cultivators who would have given up everything to take revenge under normal circumstances did not have any thoughts of taking revenge on the cultivators who had caused their losses. After all, compared to being blinded by the murderous aura and being controlled by the world, what was this kind of damage that did not endanger one's soul but one's life? I'm still too weak. This thought appeared in the hearts of almost all the cultivators at this moment. While these cultivators were going through all sorts of psychological changes, the changes that were happening in the world below did not affect them at all. The huge whirlpool in the center of the world was still rotating, constantly sweeping more and more murderous aura into the whirlpool. The murderous aura was then transferred to an extremely mysterious place, and the murderous aura's influence on the world was suppressed as much as possible. During this process, all the living beings in the world were frozen. Although they desperately wanted to obey the murderous aura's influence on their souls and tear other living beings to shreds and destroy them, they could not move their bodies at all. However, they were unable to move their bodies at all. They were unable to continue with the actions that their hearts hoped for. This world was simply too vast. The amount of murderous aura contained in the sea of murderous aura that covered the entire world was simply too much. With so much murderous aura, even with the huge whirlpool frantically absorbing it, it was impossible for it to completely absorb all the murderous aura in a short period of time. After a few years, when the whirlpool had grown to the point where it almost completely enveloped the entire central continent, the surface of the sea of murderous aura finally dropped to a level that was 10,000 feet above the ground. This was also the minimum amount of murderous aura that could remain in liquid form. The instant the liquid level crossed the threshold of 10,000 feet, the murderous aura in the liquid state suddenly began to churn as if it was boiling. Boundless murderous aura began to be released from the churning bubbles and spread to the entire world. Under this change, the influence of the whirlpool on the murderous aura was greatly strengthened. The speed at which the whirlpool expanded suddenly increased by several times. The same suction force had a completely different effect on a liquid and a gas. When the murderous aura began to turn from liquid to gas, the suction force of the whirlpool, which was originally only able to cover the entire central continent, had already expanded to the point where it could cover the entire world. In this way, the speed at which the murderous aura was absorbed would naturally increase by a large margin. The speed at which the murderous aura liquefied into liquid wasn't slow, but the speed at which it turned back into gas was even faster. In just a few short months, the original sea of murderous aura had completely vaporized and turned into a boundless black fog that filled the world. The murderous aura was also affected by the huge whirlpool that covered the entire world. It began to frantically revolve along the whirlpool and finally flowed into the center of the whirlpool, where the suction force was produced. By the time the sea of murderous aura had completely vaporized, 60 to 70% of the murderous aura had already entered the center of the whirlpool and disappeared from this world. When the sea of murderous aura had completely vaporized, the whirlpool's suction force on the murderous aura increased once again. In just a few short days, all the murderous aura in this world had been completely absorbed by the center of the whirlpool. This world had once again returned to its previous state of clarity before the murderous aura was born. As all the murderous aura was absorbed, all the living beings in this world that had been frozen started to regain their ability to move. All of them began to look around in bewilderment. During the process of being frozen, they had indeed been affected by the murderous aura. Their hearts were filled with endless rage and ruthlessness. However, at this moment, after the murderous aura in their hearts had been completely sucked out, their minds had clearly regained their clarity. Even the various experiences that they had encountered when they were affected by the murderous aura had become blurry at this moment. It was as if they had experienced it in their previous lives. After being lost for a while, they gradually regained their senses. All sorts of cries, roars, screams, laughter, and joy continuously appeared from all living beings. The reason why there was such a complicated reaction was actually very simple. Although they were blurry about what they had experienced in the previous tribulations, they knew where they were right now. They also knew how many injuries they had suffered, and they could understand how much they had lost in the things and people that they treasured. In this way, cries, roars, and screams would naturally appear. As long as they were still alive, they could still lament their losses, and laughter and joy would naturally appear. However, the losses that were originally enough for them to risk everything and perish together with their enemies were no longer enough for any living beings to have any thoughts of attacking other living beings. Although they had escaped the tribulations, the trauma that they had suffered in the tribulations clearly wouldn't disappear so easily. Under such trauma, they were extremely repulsed by fighting and killing. Even if someone wanted to attack them, it would be very difficult for them to even think of resisting. Luo Fan didn't care about the changes in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, he was dealing with the endless murderous aura that he had gathered. When the murderous aura spread out and covered the world, even though it had liquefied, it still filled the entire world densely. In fact, He even had to look for a way out from the depths of the void. However, at this moment, the boundless murderous aura formed a towering tower in the middle of the world after it was gathered by him. The tower was black and stood at the center of the world. It looked like the backbone of the world. Although the entire tower was formed from murderous aura, it didn't give off any murderous aura at this moment. On the contrary, it seemed like the ruler of the world, the core of the world. It was as if the entire world revolved around it. In fact, it felt as if the entire world was formed by the power leaking out of this giant tower. Chapter 2386. The tower compressed the ominous aura that filled the entire world. Even though Luo Fan had already condensed it, it was still a hidden danger that would not erupt in a short period of time. If it was left here and not dealt with, it would eventually erupt one day and bring disaster to this world. Especially when the development of this world at every single moment would definitely produce an enormous amount of karmic karma, and these karmic karma would transform into baleful chi that ceaselessly accumulated in this world. In the end, it would only cause this enormous tower to grow larger and larger, and it would become more and more dangerous. When it finally erupted, the impact would become more and more terrifying. Therefore, it was imperative to get rid of this giant tower. It's best if I can use up the ominous aura in this giant tower in a certain way. If that's the case, I can set up a trial mechanism. The thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. A strange smile appeared on his face. He suddenly thought of some of the natural trial mechanisms that had appeared in many special worlds. If he could combine this mechanism with the giant tower that was condensed from the ominous aura, it would be quite interesting. It could use up the ominous aura that had accumulated in this world and give the living beings in this world some benefit. It would give the living beings in this world another way to grow. With that thought in mind, he naturally did not hesitate anymore. With a slight thought, the light in the world began to undergo a subtle change. In an instant, the light in the world that connected the countless lights and shadows began to undergo an indescribable change to the lights and shadows. Amidst the change, the entire world began to tremble slightly. Faintly, even the great Tao in the unseen world began to undergo various subtle changes during this process. As for the rules and laws that were derived from the great Tao, they underwent a drastic change in an instant. Rumbling sounds reverberated across the entire world in an instant. All the living beings in this world heard these voices at the same time. For a moment, all sorts of indescribable fear appeared in the hearts of these living beings, causing them to tremble. Even Duan Shi felt an indescribable sense of uneasiness at this moment. The tribulation had just passed, and all living beings were still in a kind of dream. They couldn't believe what had happened in this world, and they couldn't believe that the tribulation that almost made them unable to reincarnate had really passed. Now that such a huge commotion had occurred, how could they not think that the tribulation had reappeared? Once they began to think in such a manner, fear would naturally be unavoidable. Fortunately, this change did not last too long. It didn't take long for everything to calm down. The rumbling noises had completely disappeared. The entire world seemed to be no different from before. Only those cultivators with keen senses were able to sense that some sort of incomprehensible change seemed to have occurred in this world, and there was an additional faint pressure. It was a kind of pressure that seemed to contain boundless danger, as well as boundless opportunities. Teacher changed the rules of heaven and earth. At this instant, Duan Shi's eyes lit up in the place where Luo Fan lived in seclusion. His heart was filled with indescribable shock. Even when Luo Fan had easily ended the tribulation of this world, he was not as shocked as he was now. After all, although it was difficult to end the tribulation, it was only something that could be done with great strength. However, to completely change the fundamental rules of heaven and earth was not something that could be done with great strength alone. It was something that could only be done if one had complete control over this world and could completely control all the rules and laws in this world. Even Duan sure didn't dare to imagine that someone would be able to do this. Even if the one who did it was Luo Fan, it was still the same, since he could sense that the fundamental rules of heaven and earth had changed. He could vaguely sense where the change was coming from. With a thought, he took a step in the direction he sensed. In the blink of an eye, he had crossed a distance of billions of light years and arrived at the center of this world, right in front of the towering Black Tower. Duan Sure was shocked once again when he saw the giant tower. It was needless to say how tall and majestic the tower was. However, that alone was not enough to shock him. After all, the era of Duanshur was only one step away from becoming a supreme emperor. For someone like him to build such a huge and majestic tower, it was only a matter of a thought. The reason he was shocked by the existence of this tower was because the tower contained mysteries that even he could not understand. Every line, every rise and fall of the tower, every trace of the veins, and even every bit of the aura it emitted, contained endless principles and endless mysteries. Even if he could sense these principles and mysteries, he could feel how minuscule he was. It was as if the tower in front of him contained secrets that he would never be able to understand in his entire life. Looking at the tower, it was as if he was looking at the great Tao, the end of cultivation, and the goal that he had been pursuing for his entire life. At that moment, he even placed this tower on the same level as the mark left behind by the true sage that he had resonated with in the past. It's really Master's method. Duan Sure mumbled in shock. At that moment, the tower seemed to have sensed something. A certain aura flashed and Duan Sure was swept up by the aura without any resistance and sent into the Black Tower. Throughout the entire process, Duan Sure could not perform any better than an ordinary person. His strength, his might, his cultivation realm, his cultivation base, and everything else could not be displayed at all. Without any ability to resist, he was sucked into the tower by this aura. Although Duan Sure could not resist the sudden change, he did not panic. However, he did not panic because of it. This was because this tower was built by his master. Since it was his master's method, he could accept it no matter what happened to him. Besides, he did not think his master would harm him all of a sudden. It was precisely because of these various thoughts that he appeared to be extremely calm and indifferent at this moment. It was this calmness and indifference that allowed him to sense more things. While he was in a trance, there seemed to be countless lights flashing through his mind. It was as if he had crossed countless worlds, space-time, and heaven and earth. What flowed through his eyes seemed to be the lives of countless living beings. In the end, when everything calmed down, he discovered that he had turned into an ordinary living being and had entered a very ordinary world. It was an ordinary world that looked like a world that he had opened up. All kinds of subtle information flowed through his mind, allowing him to suddenly understand what he needed to do. He also understood why this was happening, saving this world. As an ordinary person, I'm going to save this world that is on the brink of destruction. They really think highly of me. Even though he was in despair, Duan Sure could not help but smile bitterly. This was his task. It was also the test that he had to face. His current body was the body of an ordinary person. His senses were also the senses of an ordinary person. Even his thoughts were limited to the level of an ordinary person. However, what he was facing now was a world with countless cultivators, countless monsters, and even the world itself was filled with endless dangers. What he needed to do was to use his body, strength, senses, thoughts, and wisdom that could not be improved at all to save this world. He needed to reverse the development trend of this world from destruction so that it could escape the fate of extinction and even ascend. The difficulty was as difficult as throwing an ordinary person into the sea and asking him to drink the sea dry. Even Duan Shure's first thought when he came across this task was that it was impossible. However, Duan Shure was still Duan Shure. After cultivating to the level of a desperate person, he did not only improve his strength, divine ability, power, wisdom, thoughts, and so on. What he improved was a deeper level, his essence. This essence could not be measured directly, but it was reflected in all aspects of him. Even though everything about him was limited to the level of an ordinary person, and he could not find any way to improve himself, his essence still affected him, allowing him to find a possibility in the impossible. Therefore, he soon calmed down and began to think about how to expand this possibility and finally save the entire world. Master must have a reason for this arrangement. I must seize this opportunity. The thought flashed across his mind. Luo Fan naturally saw Duan Shi's encounter. He could not help but think, I didn't expect to encounter such a task. It seems like the rules of this Black Tower are quite complete. Duan Shi was a desperate person. He was only one step away from becoming a supreme emperor. Such an existence was naturally just an ant to Luo Fan. He could easily crush him. However, to this world, to all living beings, his strength was almost absolute. If he were to test Duan Shi using the method of testing other living beings, the test would not be effective. The final result would only be to let Duan Shi walk around the giant tower casually and then give him some reward. That wouldn't meet the purpose of the test at all. Of course, the effect might be quite good to eliminate the murderous aura. However, it was obvious that if that was the case, it would be fine for a short period of time. Many experts might come up to challenge the tower because of the novelty. However, as time passed and there were no more challenges, the tower would inevitably become a holy land for the weak. The real experts would not even spare a glance at it. In comparison, this kind of test that was imposed according to every expert's level would allow every expert to clearly feel sufficient pressure. They would be able to obtain sufficient challenges in the process of this pressure, and finally obtain a sufficient sense of achievement through this challenge. In this way, those experts would not get bored of the huge Black Tower so quickly, and only then would the test rules of the huge tower be able to exist for a long time. Seeing that the operation of the giant tower was extremely smooth, Luo Fan immediately shifted his gaze away from the Black Giant Tower. It turned to a certain special place in this part of the world. It was the place where the cultivator who sacrificed himself had set up the seal. Looking at the seal formed by the cultivator who sacrificed himself, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He would not sacrifice his life or his independence for the sake of a world, because this was not what he pursued. However, that did not stop him from having a good impression of the cultivator who sacrificed himself to save the world and all living beings. Although the endless murderous aura in this world had been completely condensed into the Black Tower, it did not stop him from having a good impression of the cultivator. Due to his good impression of the cultivator, he did not destroy the seal, nor did he completely erase the black smoke inside the seal. After all, it was still possible for the cultivator to recover in this state where the black smoke was sealed. However, if he completely erased the black smoke inside the seal and destroyed the seal, even if the cultivator escaped from this state, he would no longer be his original self. He would become a completely different existence. This was obviously what Luo Fan did not want to see. I'll give you a chance. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the light of the world slightly shook. In an instant, an invisible force was born from nothingness and directly acted on the seal. As the invisible force appeared, the seal began to tremble slightly. As it trembled, the black smoke inside the seal began to churn violently as if it felt an unimaginable fear. As it churned, it actually began to shrink. Immediately after, the invisible force gently fanned and permeated the seal from top to bottom, inside and out. As the invisible force permeated the seal, both the seal and the black smoke inside seemed to lose time and completely froze. Even the interaction between them had completely disappeared at this moment. After that, the invisible force flickered slightly, and an indescribable power instantly erupted. As this power erupted, the seal and the black fog within it completely disappeared without a trace. This place, which was originally very special in this world, returned to its state before the calamity. At the very least, this was the case for everything apart from living beings. Somewhere inside the black tower, where no living being could sense it, a seal shrouded in black smoke suddenly appeared out of thin air.